were closer up, Bran recognized one of the guards as Sir Imon Cui, who had been here last month during the previous tourney being held. The other he had never seen before, and he did not recognize the tall golden bird brooch that pinned his rainbow cape to his shoulder. Summer moved between Bran and Renly, teeth bared. The other rainbow guard stepped forward, standing between Renly and Summer, and drew his sword. Summer, Bran hissed, grabbing the direwolf's fur and tugging on it. Down. The wolf must recognize me as a stag, Renly quipped, though it was clear to see he was uneasy. Bran, control your direwolf before we must intervene, Sir Imon said, a frown on his face, his own hand tightly clutching the pommel of his sword. Bran wrapped his arms around Summer's neck and pulled him back. Reluctantly, Summer took a few steps back and stopped growling, but he refused to sit. He stood with muscles tensed and hair on edge. Sir Robar cleared his throat and gave a bow. Your Grace, it is an honor. Renly kept his eyes on Summer for a moment longer before turning to Sir Robar. I understand you participated in the tourney held here last month. Yes, Your Grace. You came in second in the melee to Lady Brienne, is that correct? Yes, Your Grace. As you no doubt saw for yourself, she is a fierce warrior. That she is. There was much talk of your own martial prowess in the time I've been here. I still have one opening left in my Rainbow Guard and I would like to offer it to you. Sir Robar dropped into a bow again. That is quite the honor you are offering me. Yet I find I must decline the offer at this moment. I am honor bound to bring my page home before I join the fighting. Renly said after a brief moment of silence, turning his attention to Bran. Brandon Stark, I had forgotten you were Sir Robar's page, though your pet was quick to remind me. I promise you we will march on King's Landing and free your father. It took Bran a second to remember his courtesies. Thank you, Your Grace. Renly smiled at him with laughter on his face, as if Bran had just told some great joke. The newest king turned his attention back to Sir Robar. In 1 week's time I will depart Highgarden for Bitterbridge, where my host of loyal Stormlords wait. I will march with 75,000 reachmen at my back. Given the danger in the realm at the moment, and the identity of your page, I think it would be safer if you were to travel with us. To Bran that didn't sound like an offer, more like a demand. Sir Robar's face remained stoic as he bowed his head and graciously accepted. King Renly was true to his word, kind of. The start of his large host set out in 1 week's time, but the army was so large it took almost 3 full days for all the men and wagons to begin the journey. Plus, on top of the army itself, the newlywed Queen Margaery also joined them on the march with a wheelhouse as wide as the road, accompanied by half a dozen ladies in waiting. Bran and Sir Robar had left on the second day, their spot about halfway through the mighty host. Bran had hoped to spend more time with Brienne, but her new duties as a member of the Rainbow Guard kept her near to Renly and Margaery, and the king and queen did not spend time near enough to where Bran and Sir Robar marched in the large host. Bran suspected Summer's hostility toward Renly was one of the reasons. Instead, Bran found that they were almost always in the company of 3 Knights of the Reach, Sir Humphrey Hightower, Sir Rhaenyra Osgrey, and Sir Adam Graves. Sir Humphrey was the youngest brother to Lady Aeleri Tyrell and the 4th son of the Lord Hightower. Despite being the uncle to Queen Margaery, Sir Loras, and their 2 older brothers, he was actually a year younger than the heir to Highgarden, Willers Tyrell. Bran found out of the 3 knights he liked Sir Humphrey the best. The man always seemed to have a smile on his face and was not afraid of Summer like the others they marched with. Sir Adam was the oldest of the 3, with thinning brown hair. His nose looked like it had been broken a few times, and when he smiled Bran saw he was missing 2 teeth, which Sir Adam had said he lost in a tourney several years back. He was the 2nd son of Lord Graves of Floral Heights. The few words Sir Adam spoke were said so softly one had to strain their ears to hear them. Sir Rhaenyra was the largest of the 3, with broad shoulders and large arms. He wielded a great sword that was strapped to his back when not in use. He was a man of duty and had little room for silly nonsense, as he called most everything that didn't involve fighting and following his grace's orders. Sir Rhaenyra was the nephew of Lord Osgrey of Stanfast. The Stormlords declared for Renly. Bran asked. Even though Stannis is the older brother? Mostly, Sir Humphrey answered, flashing a toothy smile at Bran. Houses Buckler, Grandison, and Fell, and their sworn houses, all pledged their loyalty to Stannis instead of his grace, despite the king being their liege lord. The king had gathered all of his levies at Bronze Gate, the seat of House Bycla. Imagine his surprise when a third of them were gone. From what we know, the levies left the king's camp in the middle of the night after he declared his intention to march to Highgarden and declare himself king. Sir Reynard explained at Bran's confusion. When his grace walked out of Bronze Gate to look into the report of the missing men, the gates had been closed behind him and would not open. Buckler, Grandison, and Fell were some of the stronger houses in the Stormlands, accounting for between 9 and 10,000 men. While still outnumbered by the rest of the Stormland levies almost 2 to 1, it was still a blow to Renly's cause and a boost to Stannis. Bran found out about his uncle Edmure's host being smashed outside of Riverrun by the Lannisters and the castle under siege. The Reachmen had hoped that the Riverlands would have put up more of a fight against the Lannisters, to whittle down the number of men they would be facing. Though they said in the end it didn't matter, as they would wipe the Lannisters off the map. The men of the Reach talked a lot about the glories they would achieve in battle. Bran knew his father would call them Summer Knights. The problem for Sir Robar was the pace set by this army of the Reach. The knight from the Vale complained that a baby crawling would reach Bitterbridge before them. They would travel several miles a day before the host would stop and set up multiple large camps for the night. It was there that the men would feast and drink while it was still daylight outside. It wasn't so much a march to war as one giant month-long festival. And in a seemingly never-ending parade behind the host were wagons loaded with food, hundreds of them creaking along the Rose Road to show that House Tyrell's wealth wasn't just in gold but in nourishment. A journey that should have taken them 1 fortnight took 3. Each day they marched, Sir Robar grew more and more agitated. Bran suspected there was something more than just the slow march that was causing it, but whatever it was Sir Robar would not share. The knight started avoiding most of the men around them, preferring to keep himself, and therefore Bran, away from anyone unless they were approached first. That left Bran only to talk with Sir Robar and the 3 knights of the Reach who seemed to be their constant companions. Any words Sir Robar exchanged with the 3 men were curt, which surprised Bran because Sir Robar was usually very courteous. On top of their lack of travelling buddies, despite being surrounded by 75,000 men, and the snail's pace of the host, the worst part for Bran was that he started having that weird dream again. The one where he was north of the wall in a forest of dark and twisted trees that seemed to stretch to the stars themselves. With the flock of 300 crows that sat atop a giant fist that jutted out of the ground, until an avalanche of snow and ice swept over the fist and buried all of the crows. Only to see each of the crows rise out of the snow, dark eyes now a bright icy blue. The dreams were almost every night. Except the dream wasn't always the same. It started off the same, but sometimes as the avalanche came to sweep over the crows, a white wolf would come running out of the woods and would shield a few of the crows with its body. The tumbling snow and ice would seem to split around the white wolf, going around it and sparing the crows that were behind the canine. Other times when the white wolf came, it would breathe fire, melting the snow and ice, and preventing more of the crows from being buried beneath the cold. The dream and its alternative versions would rotate every night, and each morning Bran would wake up with a headache and the feeling that he hadn't slept at all. Summer would be at his side every time he woke, golden eyes filled with concern that never faded no matter how many times Bran tried to tell the direwolf he was fine. "Are you sleeping all right?" Sir Reynard asked with a frown one morning. "You look like hell almost every day. If you were older, I'd think you to be deep into your cups every night with how haggard you look each morning," Sir Humphrey quipped another morning, though there no trace of a smile on his face. Sir Adam would only ever stare at him with a slight frown, which was the extent of his concern. Sir Robar had also expressed concern, relieving Bran of his duties most days. One night, rather than go to sleep, Sir Robar stood vigil in their tent to see if there was truth in Bran's claims that he slept every night. "You thrashed the entire night," Sir Robar said the next day, his own eyes heavy with the dark bags of exhaustion. "I tried to wake you but you wouldn't wake. Whatever dream you had, it held you too firmly in its grasp, you could not escape." When they reached Bitterbridge, Bran almost whooped with glee. He would finally be heading north, to see his family. Word had reached the Stormland camp that Robb and an army of Northmen had lifted the siege of Riverrun and that the Kingslayer was a prisoner of the Starks. But good news from the Riverlands wasn't all that greeted them. Stannis had laid siege to Storm's End, likely coming upon the giant castle a few weeks past. The Stormlanders had been split on what to do before deciding to stay at Bitterbridge and await their king's arrival. If Renly had not taken his time on his march from Highgarden, the entire army would be halfway to Storm's End by now. King Renly will ride to Storm's End with all of his cavalry, Sir Humphrey explained to Bran that night. And you and Sir Robar will be accompanying him on his journey. Bran's face scrunched in confusion. That wasn't what Renly had told him back in Highgarden. He was promised that once they had reached Bitterbridge, Bran and Sir Robar would be given leave to head north into the Riverlands. Summer growled where he sat and Sir Robar stood with gritted teeth. Summer, stay, Bran commanded. Once Bran was sure Summer would listen to him, he took off running. All four of them, Sir Robar, Sir Humphrey, Sir Raynaud, and Sir Adam, shouted in surprise at him taking off. Bran weaved his way through the legs of confused men-at-arms and around the various tents that were being raised. When they travelled, the large host has broken into multiple camps, but at Bitterbridge they assembled into one giant camp that was larger than any town. While most of the tents looked the same, there was one that was much taller and wider than the others, the king's tent. It was to that one that Bran ran to. The guards outside the entrance flaps, Sir Aemon Khuy the Yellow and a Stormland knight called Sir Parman Crane the Purple, who Bran had discovered was the man with the bird brooch, both made a move to block him from passing through the tent flaps, but he was able to duck beneath their grasping arms. Has 15,000 men, including foot and cavalry. Our cavalry alone is almost 24,000. Bran entered the lavish tent to see it packed with men. There was King Renly and Queen Margaery with Sir Garland Tyrell and Sir Loras Tyrell on either side of them. A few paces behind Renly, standing as straight as she could, was Brian. Amongst those facing his direction, Bran recognized the men known as Lord Randil Tarly, Lord Mathis Rowan, and Lord Orton Merryweather. There were a few dozen other knights and lords, all of them crammed around a table, but he either couldn't recognize them or he couldn't properly see their faces and sigils. Sir Aemon came into the tent right behind Bran, and while Bran was small enough to escape the notice of all of those gathered, the heavily armored knight caught some of their eyes. What's the meaning of this? Lord Rowan demanded, bringing everyone's attention as Sir Aemon laid an armored hand on Bran's shoulder to stop him from going any further. My apologies, Your Grace, Sir Aemon said to Renly. He slipped past us. You said when we got to Bitterbridge Sir Robar and I could go north, Bran said to King Renly, confused. But I'm told we're to go with you to Storm's End. It was at that moment that Sir Humphrey, Sir Raynaud, Sir Adam, and Sir Robar came into the tent as well, each of them panting with exertion. Is this a war council meeting or a public forum? Lord Tarly muttered distastefully, eyes narrowed at all of the newcomers. Things have changed greatly since then, King Renly answered, ignoring Lord Tarly and forcing a smile on his face. We can discuss it after the war council has met. Stop with the lies, Sir Robar cried, stepping forward in front of Bran as if to shield him from the gaze of the others. You never intended for us to part your company. Sir Robar. Bran has been your hostage since Highgarden. Bran was confused. Hostage. Like Theon was a hostage, even though his father didn't like to call him that. There were murmurs from the surrounding lords and knights. Bran is not a hostage, King Renly said. He is a guest. Shut up. Sir Robar yelled, startling Bran. He had seen the knight angry before, but never like this. You do not talk to your king like that, Sir Loras said, face reddening with his own anger. The Knight of Flowers stalked around the silent nobles gathered around the table, stopping halfway to Sir Robar. He is no king of mine, Sir Robar said. I do not bow to a man who lies to a child of 9 that he is a guest while he has armed guards watching his every move. Bran turned and looked at the 3 knights he had grown to know and like over the past 3 weeks. Sir Humphrey looked away in shame. Sir Raynaud met his gaze briefly before he found his feat more interesting. Only Sir Adam held his gaze, lacking any of the guilt the other 2 showed. You will show King Renly respect, a man with a blue and gold spiral for a sigil said. King Renly is the king this realm needs, Sir Loras declared. Most of the others voiced their agreement. He is the best of them. Sir Robar undid the sword belt at his waist and threw it at the ground. Let's not keep this charade any longer. I am a hostage like my page, and you, Renly Baratheon, seek to usurp your brother's claim. That brought gasps from all, loudest from Queen Margaery. Sir Loras withdrew his sword from its sheath, eyes narrowed. Renly stayed silent, his face hard as stone as he looked at Sir Robar. That you would dare say such a thing, Sir Loras breathed, struggling to speak around his anger. "Those of us who aren't stupid know why you defend Renly and this farce so ardently," Sir Loras Sir Robar said, tone sharp. Then he added with a shake of his head, "Your own sister's husband." Sir Loras had heard enough. He stalked forward, sword raised. Sir Robar held out his hands away from his body, making no move for the sword he had thrown to the ground. "Come and show everyone here the honor of King Renly and his personal guard," Sir Robar said. Bran wanted to scream at Sir Loras or to try to tackle him to the ground or something, but he was frozen in place. His eyes shifted to Brienne, who looked conflicted. She rocked forward and took a halting step, warring between what was right and her loyalty to the man she took as king. "Loras," the Queen's voice cut through the rising tension like a whip. Sir Loras' blade stopped inches from Sir Robar's chest. The youngest Tyrell's breathing was laboured, so heavy with anger that he struggled to draw breath into his chest. The Queen's voice seemed to snap the king into action. Renly squared his shoulders, and with hardened blue eyes looked at the scene in front of him. "Sir Loras, stand down." Sir Loras looked back at Renly for several seconds before taking a few steps backwards and sheathing his sword. "Sir Humphrey, Sir Adam, Sir Reynard, bring the hostages back to their tent and make sure they don't leave again for the rest of the night," Renly ordered. Sir Reynard was the one who approached Bran as the other two grabbed Sir Robar by the arms. The second son of House Royce allowed himself to be led from the tent. "Come Bran," Sir Reynard said, placing his hand lightly between Bran's shoulders to lead him after Sir Robar. Hundreds of thoughts swarmed in Bran's head, but the one that jumped out at him was for Summer's safety. Hostages didn't get to keep their direwolf that could easily kill a man. He prayed to the old gods that Summer would sense the danger he was now in and run, otherwise Renly would have his men make a cloak out of Summer's skin. Chapter 35, Robb 9. Loras Tyrell is arrogant, short-tempered, and impetuous. When his anger gets the best of him, he'll act way before he thinks. Robb 9. The comet had appeared in the sky sometime before their ambush of the Kingslayer. Some of the men had seen it as they lay in wait to spring the trap, but most of them had been too concerned with what was happening on the ground to pay any attention to the sky above them. It looked like someone had cut the heavens and left a bloody gash in the sky behind. Everyone declared it a blessing from the gods, some said the old, while others said the new. No matter which god sent it, everyone agreed it could only mean one thing, that their cause was righteous and they would be granted victory by whichever of the gods they believed in. The gods were blessing the wolves of winter, the young wolf and the white wolf, who had led them to victory and captured the Kingslayer. Directly after the battle, Robb had the 500 infantry start cleaning up the battlefield. That meant collecting their wounded for the few healers they had, stripping the dead of valuable armor and weapons, and gathering the prisoners. They hadn't just taken Sir Jaime Lannister prisoner, they had captured Lord Quinton Bainfort, the heir to Hornval Sir Tytos Brax, Lord Regin Ardistran, Lord Garth Greenfield, Lord Goran Westerling, and 3 of the Kingslayer's cousins, Cleosfrey, Shenfrey, and Willem Lannister. Plus another 200 men who were a mixture of men-at-arms and sellswords. The rest of the force had been killed, either in the battle itself or afterwards as the assigned men moved through the carnage and killed the Lannister wounded who suffered from more than minor injuries. He led the cavalry a half-mile to the south and had them set camp for the night. Though camp was too strong of a word, as they didn't dig ditches or set up stakes. They didn't even set up the tents and cots. Shifts were assigned for guard duty and then they slept on the ground, some men falling asleep while still in their armor. While the infantry stayed behind with the wounded and prisoners, the cavalry would continue onwards. Riverrun was still over half a day's ride and he wanted his men to get as much sleep as possible, something they haven't had a chance to get since leaving the Twins, with the hope that they'd be good and rested in time to descend upon the besiegers by tomorrow evening. When the morning dawned and the sun began to creep into the sky, Robb had found himself dragged from the land of dreams. He sent Grey Wind to wake up Jon and Theon, and then sent them to wake up the other nobles of his war council. Despite the sun starting to chase away the darkness of night, the comet was still visible, looking to be in about the same place in the sky it had been last night before he had drifted off to sleep. As he waited for everyone to gather, he used a stick to draw in the dirt a representation of Riverrun and the 3 hosts that besieged it. Normally he'd have a table and maps, but those had been left behind with the infantry when he left the Twins. "This is Riverrun," Robb said, tapping the center of his drawing once the leading lords and knights were gathered. We can hit the northern camp tonight after sunset, and if we're quick about it we'll be able to meet the eastern and western camps when they try to cross the river to come to the northern camp's aid. May I make a suggestion? Uncle Brindon asked. By all means, uncle, this is the land of your family after all. His great-uncle drew his sword from the sheath and extended the line in the dirt that was supposed to be the Tumblestone farther west. There is a ford you can use to cross the Tumblestone about 4 leagues upriver from Riverrun. An X was drawn to indicate the ford. Been there since I was a boy. Rob stared at his dirt drawing for a moment, his mind spinning with possibilities. I imagine they'd be keeping Uncle Edmure in the western camp, since that's the quickest retreat to the Westerlands. So we'd want to hit it, and prevent them from leaving with their prisoners. Or worse, executing them before fleeing. So we cross at this ford? Sir Patrick Mallister asked, eyes focused on the X drawn in the dirt. Rob shook his head. No, and yes. I will take a portion of the cavalry and cross at the ford. Uncle Brindon, you will be in charge of the main host of the cavalry. Tonight, after dinner, I want you to hit the northern camp. Shortly after you do so, I'll hit the western camp. Sir Ryman Free looked at the dirt drawing with a frown. Will you be able to get your cavalry in position in time? It will be close, but if we leave now, we can do it. Rob left most of the northern cavalry with his uncle because Garons weren't the fastest of mounts. He selected 200 of the Stark cavalry that used coursers, and would take with him the Riverlands cavalry of the Freys, Mallisters, and the 80 cavalry that Sir Mark and Sir Damon had left from the Battle of Riverrun. Combined with those who acted as his personal guard, he had about 1,250 cavalry. He made the northern members of his personal battle guard who rode Garons swap out the smaller, more sure-footed horses for the larger and faster coursers and destriers, which included John, despite his reluctance. John's Garon had been a gift from the Umbers at the end of his fostering with them. They rode hard for hours, and hard riding left little room for conversation. Rob wouldn't let them rest until they found and crossed the ford Uncle Brindon had mentioned. It took them just after midday to find it. It was deeper than expected, the water coming up to their feet. It was a good thing he had them switch out from the northern Garons, who would have struggled crossing the water and had their riders soaked up to their knees. Once across they stopped for the midday meal, hard bread and strips of dried meat washed down with watered-down wine. The horses were allowed to graze and drink from the river. Some of the horses took the opportunity to lay down along the banks, but the rest was short-lived. If they wanted to arrive to attack the western camp shortly after Uncle Brindon attacked the northern camp, then they would need to continue at their frenzied pace, so despite their tired mounts, Rob pushed on. Hours later, with the sun having already set, Rob could see the flames of campfires in the distance. He brought the entire column to a stop and strained his ears. It was hard to hear anything over the panting of the horses, but the old gods were good to them as the moon was bright in the sky and there were few clouds to block its light, giving them enough to see clearly. John, see if the attack on the northern camp has started. John didn't respond, but he did move his horse forward at a slow pace, Ghost moving silently at his side. After a few moments both his brother and Ghost disappeared into the darkness. As the horses caught their breath, Rob thought he could faintly hear shouting. They were still a distance away, but if he squinted, there was definitely movement in the camp. Dark figures kept moving in front of the flames. There was activity, he just didn't know what kind. He wondered if they had arrived too late. If the battle was already over and the western camp was on high alert, it would be foolish to attack. All he would get was his men needlessly slaughtered. Ghost appeared from the dark, startling a few of the men. John was right behind his direwolf. It started, John said, voice solemn. Men from the western camp are trying to cross the river. Then we arrived just in time. Move out. He kicked his heels into the side of his horse and started forward at a walk, John falling into line with the rest of the cavalry behind them. As if sensing what needed to be done, Grey Wind and Ghost took off ahead of the horses. As they drew closer, Rob could see that Ghost and Grey Wind had each killed one of the sentries that guarded the gates and were already bounding towards others who, instead of sounding the alarm, were running in terror. Most of the attention from the Lannister men was turned toward the northern camp, where a fierce fight was taking place, and even the sentries had forgotten their senses and duty. Rob urged his horse, and the cavalry behind him, into a trot. The camp was defended with 2 lines of trenches and stakes. During the day there were gaps between the trenches and the stakes that allowed one to pass into and out of the camp. And the gaps in the two lines of defenses were not in a straight line. The second one was 20 feet to the left of the first one. At night, the gap in the stakes was filled with a movable row of stakes to prevent cavalry from rushing through at night, like they planned on doing. A few dozen men rode ahead of the rest of them, some falling on the other outer sentries, while the rest moved to the gap in the trench. They dismounted from their horses and worked as a team to move the stakes out of the way. More poured through the opening in the first line of defenses, some too eager as their horses fell into the second trench or tried to jump the trench only to be impaled on the stakes behind it. Soon the second section of stakes was moved out of the way. Rob commanded his men to move slowly between the two lines of defenses, but once they passed the inner defenses, they could run free. And run free they did. Even though shouts went up about their presence, and many of those who had been waiting to cross the river now turned toward them, armored and fairly organized, it wasn't enough. Not when the drawbridge over the moat was dropped and men from Riverrun rushed into the rear of the Lannister forces, pinning them between two forces. It quickly became a rout and Rob was reminded of the battle from last night. Those who tried to flee found themselves hemmed in by their own defenses. Some jumped into the Tumblestone as a way to flee but found themselves sinking beneath the water because of their chainmail or plate, the current dragging them downriver. Hundreds threw down their weapons and surrendered. Rob made sure the Riverlands prisoners were secured and guarded so nothing would happen to them, whether from the Lannisters or accidentally by Rob's own men. It could be hard to discern who was an enemy and who wasn't in the dark, and the last thing they needed was one of the Riverlords being mistaken for a Lannister and cut down in some hedge knight's bloodlust. As the northern camp and the western camp were put to the sword, the host at the third Lannister camp grabbed what they could and retreated into the dark. With another victory secured, the cries from the cavalry echoed into the night. Young Wolf! Young Wolf! Young Wolf! While others like Jon and Sir Patrick Mallister oversaw everything that followed a battle, such as the securing of prisoners and the gathering of the wounded, Rob was given rooms inside the castle and went to bed. When he awoke, it was to the news that Lord Andros Brax had died while trying to cross the Tumblestone to aid the northern camp during the start of the battle last night. The raft he had been on had overturned after being attacked by Tully men from the battlements of Riverrun, and the man's heavy plate had dragged him to the depths of the river. The noble prisoners they had taken were Sirs Burton and Marlon Crickehall and Sir Melwyn Susfield. The rest of the nobles for the force had either been with the Kingslayer during the previous night's battle, killed during the chaos of the camps, or had been a part of the eastern camp that had retreated into the night. As he broke his fast, Rob had been given heartwarming news. A raven that had arrived a few days ago letting him know that Sansa had arrived at White Harbor and after resting for a few days was safely on her way back to Winterfell. He sent a raven to White Harbor thanking Lord Wyman Mardaily for not only the news but for his hospitality toward his sister, and another to Winterfell to let them know of his victories. Sansa being home safe and not in the clutches of the Lannisters, gave them an even stronger foot to stand on when it came to negotiating the release of his father from King's Landing. Before midday, Outriders had easily spotted the surviving Lannister camp, the one to the east that had retreated during the night. They were marching south toward Pink Maiden. Rob was informed that the Red Fork was calmer the farther upstream one went, and there were half a dozen fords between Riverrun and Pink Maiden they would be able to cross at in order to retreat back down the river road and into the Westerlands. Lord Blackwood, who led the defenders of Riverrun during its besiegement, believed the eastern Lannister camp had about 4,000 men, give or take a couple of hundred. Rob considered riding along the west bank of the Red Fork and trying to catch the Lannister host as it crossed at whichever ford they chose to cross at, but he had pushed his men hard since leaving the twins. They needed a few days of rest to make up for the 2 weeks of hard riding before setting out again. Though he did have the Outriders keep an eye on the force, to make sure they did retreat back west and didn't try to besiege Pink Maiden or Wayfarer's Rest. Later in the day, the infantrymen they had left behind in what was being called the Battle of the Whispering Woods, had arrived with the wounded and prisoners from that battle. "Why is the Kingslayer gagged?" Rob asked, gazing upon the man who had a piece of cloth tied tightly around his mouth as he was led with the others down into Riverrun's dungeons. "He doesn't shut the fuck up." Hendry Bracken, nephew of Lord Bracken and the one to lead the infantry, replied. The noble prisoners would have to be given nicer rooms eventually, as befitting their noble birth, but no one was in any rush to make such accommodations for them. The number of Riverland's nobles had grown to include Lord Titus Blackwood, Lord John Osbracken, Lord Clement Piper, Sir Lewis Piper, Lord Theomar Smallwood, Lord Lyman Goodbrooke, Sir Gus Goodbrooke, and of course Uncle Ed Muir. 2 days after the siege had been lifted, after the wounded and dead had been sorted, there had been a small feast held to thank the Northmen for coming to their aid. It felt good being able to sit, relax, and enjoy a good meal, something Rob hadn't done since they left Moat Cailin. After the feast they had gathered in Uncle Ed Muir's solar to work out what to do from there. It was a bit strange for Rob to no longer be the sole most powerful voice in the room, now sharing such a position with his uncle. It was easy to see the relation between Rob and his uncle, as they both had auburn hair, blue eyes and the same high cheekbones, though his uncle sported a thick beard that partially covered said cheekbones. The solar couldn't fit everyone, so the amount of people was limited. Rob had invited Great Jon Umber, Mage Mormont, Hellman Tallheart, Theon, and John, who Uncle Ed Muir had gazed at with suspicious eyes. From the Riverlands was Uncle Bryndon, Titus Blackwood, John Osbracken, Ryman Free, and Clement Piper. Between the levies who had retreated into Riverrun to defend it, and the few hundred that had been freed from Lannister clutches, they had another 1,800 men to add to their forces. Men they would need for what Rob planned next. "I mean to march on Tywin Lannister," Rob said to those around him. "If I only do so with the Northern cavalry at my back, then I will. Though the North will be honored if the Riverlands marches at our side." Uncle Ed Muir quickly agreed, and Rob thought him eager for a victory after the defeat he had suffered and the weeks of being a prisoner. Unfortunately for his uncle's need to prove himself a capable ruler, they found out hours before they were to march that such plans were no longer needed. A raven from Harroway's town arrived 2 days later, shortly before midday, telling them that Tywin Lannister and his host had retreated back in the direction of Harrenhal after a brief skirmish with northern forces, a skirmish that never should have happened. Rob had instructed Lord Bolton to lure Tywin Lannister north but to avoid battle. He had picked Lord Bolton specifically because the man was cautious in his decision-making. Though that would have to be dealt with at another time. If Tywin Lannister did retreat to Harrenhal, which made the most sense, then going after the Lannister host was no longer the smart move. Between Harrenhal's towering walls and the nearly 18,000 men to defend it, Tywin Lannister was untouchable. Now the decision moving forward became a lot less certain. Then on top of all that, word came that Renly Baratheon had also declared himself king and was backed by the Reach and most of the Stormlands. "That's 3 kings now. We need to sue for peace with King Joffrey," Lord Bracken said. That was met with jeers by most of the men there, especially Lord Blackwood. Even in the north the infamous feud between the Brackens and the Blackwoods was well known. Peace. The Riverlands burn because of the Lannisters. Titus Blackwood responded, voice raised in anger. "And if we agree to peace we free up old Tywin to march to the defense of King's Landing," Great Jon added. "I'd much rather keep him in the field and let one of the Stag brothers burn that wretched city to the ground." "We can't keep fighting Tywin Lannister," Sir Ryman Free said. "We all know what that man is capable of, the Castamarez, the Tarbecks, and now the Lollistons. Let's besiege Harrenhal and starve the Lion into submission. And get flanked by a host from the Crown lands. Demand restitutions," Hellman Tallheart said. "Lannister gold to pay for the damages they've done to your lands and people. We should pledge to one of the Baratheon brothers. Stannis is next in line." "Bah, Stannis is a miserable cunt. Renly has a far larger army. From the Lannisters we ask for peace but make ready for war," Rob voiced over the others, getting nods from a few. "We demand restitutions, prisoner exchanges, and troop withdrawal, but we continue to gather our forces to strike should our demands not be met. As for the Baratheon brothers, there's no need to rush into pledging our loyalty to either one of them yet. Stannis claims Joffrey and his siblings are illegitimate, which would make him the legal heir, but if they are truly King Robert's children then Joffrey is the rightful king." That brought scowls to the faces of all of them. If they were outside, Rob knew the Great Jon would have spat at the mention of Joffrey's name. No one wanted to pledge loyalty to Joffrey and his Lannister relatives. Lorque, Clegane, and some Issozi sellsword company that calls themselves the Brave Companions still run amok in the Riverlands, Clement Piper pointed out. While we wait for peace they continue to kill our small folk, steal our crops, and burn our villages. "We'll send men to deal with them," Uncle Ed Muir promised. "And to take back Daeari. Deari had been under siege when Rob had left the twins. Sometime between leaving the seat of House Free and lifting the siege of Riverrun, the castle must have been taken. The walled town of Maidenpool had been sacked as well, and Lord Root, Lord of Harroway's town, had thought his town would be next if the Northmen led by Lord Bolton hadn't lured the lions north. "I have men north of the Trident. The North will take back Deari," Rob assured. "I will send a message to Lord Root, who can send riders to deliver a message to Lord Bolton." Rob didn't know how far north Bolton retreated after his ill-advised skirmish with Tywin Lannister, but he would have Bolton retake Deari, leave a garrison behind for the castle and then set up camp on the northern banks of the Trident to act as a foil to Tywin Lannister. More than likely Lord Deari and his family had been sent to Harrenhal before the Lannister host had headed north across the Trident. Hopefully some members of Lord Deari's household were still alive and within the castle who could act as Castellan until Lord Deari was exchanged for another prisoner. Uncle Edmure bid Lords Bracken and Blackwood to each form a group of 800 men to hunt down the groups of Lannisters led by the Mountain, Amory Lorg, and the Brave Companions. There was a host of about 6,000 rivermen in the south near the Stony September, led by Lord Shawnee. They were supposed to have met up with a force from King's Landing and attacked Tywin Lannister's host back when it was still marching on the Tower of the Rush, but that had been when Ned Stark was still Hand of the King. No one knew where this force was or what they were doing. Lord Piper was sent with a couple hundred men to find them. Between Blackwood, Bracken, and Piper, that was almost all of the rivermen they had gained upon freeing Riverrun. The rest of them would wait at Riverrun and continue to build up their forces. They would expect the 3,553 and Mallister infantry in the coming days and Lord Karstark's force of 3,000 in about 2 weeks or so. Uncle Edmure expected more men to pour in once word of Riverrun's freedom became known. Rob didn't hold out as high a hope as his uncle and expected a few hundred at most, which would put their numbers close to 12,000 once everyone arrived. The terms for peace they wrote up were simple. The immediate withdrawal of all Lannister troops from the Riverlands. The payment of 3 million gold dragons to the nobles of the Riverlands to rebuild their lands and to compensate the small folk for the horrors inflicted on them by Lannister brigands. The exchange of prisoners of equal status, starting with Sir Jaime Lannister for Lord Eddard Stark, and the ransoming of any other nobles to their families as appropriate. They made no mention of swearing fealty to Joffrey. Rob would wait for his father to make such a decision, and Uncle Edmure would hold a grudge against the Lannisters for the rest of his life. With the Raven sent out to Harrenhal, Rob planned his next moves should peace not be an option. He sat with Jon and Theon in the rooms provided to him within the castle of his uncle, just the three of them as it has been for months at Winterfell, and looked over a map of southern Westeros. "Once they find out where this southern Riverland host is, we can march south along here." Theon pointed to the land west of the God's Eye, link up with them and then come upon King's Landing from the Gold Road. "We leave Bolton to keep Tywin Lannister at Harrenhal." Rob made a non-committal noise at Theon's plan. It was like Theon, brash and bold, but not much thought went into it. Even if they linked up with the 6,000 men near the Stony September, that would only give them 18,000. Not enough to take King's Landing by force. And that would leave them vulnerable to any other force out there. "We should march south, but instead of turning east we should turn west," Jon said, his finger showing what he meant. "Travel around the southern tip of the mountains and come upon the Westerlands from the south. Silver Hill, Cornfield, and Cricker Hall could all be ours before the Lannisters know what hit them." Different than the usual cautious and reactive plans Jon came up with, but still not bold enough for what was needed. Rob knew his brother was looking to avoid needing to pass Golden Tooth and Deep Den, but it would take months for such a move to pay off, time the Lannisters could potentially build a new host they would have to contend with. Even though Rob thought the plan lacking, he was glad to see Jon willing to change his tactics up. Rob had a different idea. Chapter 36, Arya 2. /n. Does replacing old chapters with newer versions have the story pop up as being updated for those who have it favorited /followed? If so, that's my bad. I decided to write and post this new chapter, as a sort of apology. So far I've only rewritten up to chapter 8. And I put that in quotes because there wasn't much change in any of them. Each one is between 400 to 700 words longer, but there aren't any big additions. It's mostly expanding on thoughts and adding more dialogue. Minor adds are things like mentioning Ceilidh dancing a few times as a First Men tradition to expand upon Northern culture a bit. I'm also trying to do away with more modern phrases to make the dialogue sound more fitting to the Asoyaf setting. Arya 2. If Arya had thought her mother overbearing before, the past few turns of the moon had shown her how wrong she was. With father a prisoner in King's Landing, Robb off marching to war in the Riverlands, Bran somewhere in the Reach, last word putting him in Old Town, and no word at all on Sansa, her mother had somehow become even more overbearing. As if that was even possible. She escorted Arya and Rickon from their morning meal to their lessons with Maester Stillowin, which Rickon had started attending shortly after Robb left. Often she had to sit in on the lessons, to keep Rickon under control since Maester Stillowin was getting too old to do so. While Rickon was under the watchful eye of Sir Roderick in the afternoons, having started his sword training as well, her mother would often accompany Arya to her afternoon lessons with Septa Mordane. Her mother's worries over them meant she neglected many of her duties as the Lady of Winterfell, but Winifred picked up the slack without issue, this in spite of her pregnancy. Lord Wyman had made sure his granddaughter was well educated and capable of not just running a household, but also an entire city, and it showed in the effortless way she took over duties. And when Arya's mother's focus shifted back to her Lady of Winterfell duties, Winifred handed them over without complaint. Winifred's abilities allowed Lady Catelyn to hover over both Arya and Rickon, as if they too would up and march south at any moment. But her mother would have no worries about either of them going south. Arya didn't want to go south, where girls were treated even more like fragile things that would pass out at the sight of violence. Well, maybe Dawn wasn't so bad from what she had read, but it would take half a year to walk there, and Maester Stillowin said it was so hot in the summer that people fainted from the heat, as if that wasn't the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard. Fainting from seeing a man's head chopped off was one thing, but fainting because of the heat. And Rickon would never go south because he hated the south for taking all his family away from him, and the old gods help whatever man tried to make Rickon go south too. Despite being almost 5 years old, Rickon was growing more and more wild and temperamental the older he got. Traits which were reflected in his direwolf. Shaggydog would growl and nip at anyone who angered Rickon, and given how easily her youngest brother could get worked up, that was a lot of people. Nymeria did her best to control Shaggydog, but the wolves were of similar size, and the times they came to blows ended with Nymeria yipping in pain as much as Shaggydog. Her mother tried her hardest to get Rickon to behave, but it was a losing battle cause, as he would just howl in response, as if he was a direwolf and not a human. Because they couldn't get Rickon under control, and by extension Shaggydog, they had confined her brother's direwolf to the Godswood, much to Rickon's anger. And Shaggydog voiced his anger by howling for hours at a time and charging at the servants who were tasked with feeding the beast. Now hunks of raw meat were thrown into the Godswood from atop the battlements, and the only ones brave enough to go into the Godswood were Rickon, Arya when she had Nymeria with her, and the wildling Osha. Arya knew that her mother needed to do something about Shaggydog soon, because the Godswood was where the people of the North worshipped. Even though they were the servants to House Stark, one could only keep people from their place of prayer for so long before they became angered. Especially if they thought the new gods worshipping Southron Lady was dragging her feet on the issue because she cared little for the religion of the old gods, or so Arya had overheard one of the servants mutter while sneaking around Winterfell. In her lessons with Maester Stillowin and Septa Mordane, there was a general nervousness amongst all of those who attended. Jarell and Lyanna Mormont had been briefly reunited with their mother and oldest sister before they had marched off with Robb to fight the Lannisters. Winifred and Wyler hadn't been able to see their father or uncle before both of them had joined the northern host as it marched into the Neck. Even Beth Castle had not heard word about her cousin Jory, who had led the guards in King's Landing. And the letter they had received from Joffrey had made no mention of anyone besides Arya's father. Which had made the status of Noto only Sansa, but over 100 people who had served House Stark unknown, people who had relatives within Winterfell. While there were few conversations about the fighting, the air was thick with worry for their loved ones who had marched off to war. Every battle fought meant another chance for them to be killed. And while the war was hundreds of miles away, it didn't mean those left behind weren't on edge. Through her grandfather Winifred had hired an arbalist from Braavos to make crossbows to help in the defense of Winterfell. Sir Roderick had been aghast at the idea, considering them a coward's weapon, and her lady mother had been against the cost of such an endeavor. Yet, Winifred had insisted that such a thing would only benefit Winterfell should it ever come under siege. It took a few turns of the moon at most to train someone in the use of a crossbow, compared to the year minimum it took to train one in a bow and arrow. If Winterfell ever found itself besieged, they could train some of the servants in the use of the crossbow to give them even more manpower to place on the walls to fight off any attempts to take the castle. Eventually Arya's mother had relented, and the Arbalist and his household, which included his wife, 2 kids, 1 journeyman, 2 apprentices, and 4 servants, had arrived at Winterfell several nights ago. They were given 2 of the houses in Wintertown that sat vacant during the summer years. The contract called for 300 crossbows to be made, which Arya had been told would take over a year. Arya was doing her own part for the defense of Winterfell. She had never tried as hard in anything as she did in her water dancing lessons with Syrio. If Winterfell ever did come under attack, she would do her part to defend her home. Opening your eyes is all that is needed, Syrio had explained to her, after telling her the story of how he became the first Sword of Braavos. The heart lies and the head plays tricks with us, but the eyes see true. Look with your eyes. Hear with your ears. Taste with your mouth. Smell with your nose. Feel with your skin. Then comes the thinking, afterward, and in that way knowing the truth. Men will underestimate you because you are girl, Syrian lectured another time. You will never match a man in strength, do not try. But you can use men's arrogance and strength against them. Let them swing their wild swings at where you stand, for you will no longer be there. And what do you do when you are challenged by a knight in full plate? Syrian asked during another lesson, as they discussed the various armors men in Westeros wore. Target the weak points. Arya guessed. Silly girl. If you are challenged by a knight in full plate, you run. Run, she had asked, half in confusion and half in shock. Syrio shook his head as he gazed down his beak nose at her, tutting at her like she was a toddler who had jumped in a puddle and dirtied their clothes. Full plate has little weakness to a stabbing weapon. The metal is strong and it is layered to prevent gaps. You will need much luck to exploit the weaknesses. Your sword will not pierce it, nor are you strong enough where you can hope to dent it. And while you are trying to exploit a weakness, a man in plate will be attacking you. How long can you evade the attacks of a trained man? Not long, I say, but you can outrun a man in all that armor, this I know. They were a few of the many lessons he had passed to her in their time training together. It had been over half a year since she had started training with Syrio, and she wanted nothing more than to test herself against someone, but none of the Stark guards would spar with her because she was the daughter of their liege lord and only 12 years old. If Jon was still here, she knew he'd spar against her, even if he would take it easy on her. Bran would spar against her too, even if he wouldn't pose the challenge of someone older and stronger, though she supposed her brother had improved much since they last sparred, weeks before he had left for the Vale over a year ago. She sat on the ground of the Godswood, near the giant weirwood tree with its sad face, sucking down air. She had fresh bruises from another session with Syrio, who had told her she still had a long way to go as he easily dodged her attacks and rewarded her for every mistake she made with a new bruise. Nymeria sat next to the hot spring in front of the weirwood, panting heavily. The direwolf hadn't moved from that spot in hours, nor was it particularly hot out. Arya suspected her direwolf was mocking her, panting heavily to match Arya's own deep breathing as she tried to catch her breath. Stupid wolf, Arya muttered, narrowing her eyes. Nymeria growled lightly, her own eyes narrowing for a moment before she gave Arya what could only be considered a smile, as if sharing in some joke. Arya could only shake her head at Nymeria's antics. With effort she climbed to her feet and made her way out of the Godswood. She could feel the sullen glare of Shadowdog from somewhere deeper in the trees. Her brother's direwolf hid from her and Nymeria whenever they entered the Godswood, watching them from afar and refusing any attempts to bring him out into the open. After making sure the large door to the Godswood was firmly closed behind her, so Shaggywolf could not escape, she wandered between the inner walls until she came upon the great open yard where the smithy was. There she found Beth Castle and Wyler Marndale standing off to the side, giggling into their hands. They were trying not to make it obvious that they were staring at the smithy, or more specifically Mickon's new apprentice Gendry. The boy, though she supposed man would be a better choice, who her father had sent north from King's Landing, was hammering on metal that glowed bright red with heat. He stood in breeches and a thin tunic bare of any sleeves and drenched in sweat. She supposed he was good-looking, with his thick black hair and bright blue eyes and his nice smile that made a dimple appear on his right cheek but not his left, but it wasn't anything that she noticed. Besides, Beth Castle swooning over some boy was not anything new or an indication of one's good looks. For years Sir Roderick's daughter swooned over both John and Rob, which Arya thought stupid. Her older brothers weren't good looking, they were John and Rob. Gendry wiped the sweat on his forehead with his arm, and casually threw his head to the side to try to get the wet hair out of his eyes. The movement sent Beth and Wyler into another giggling fit. Arya rolled her eyes. And people thought she was childish. She spotted her mother and Winifred walking to the Great Hall. Well, Winifred waddled more than walked given the size of her belly. Her good sister was due to give birth within the next moon's turn, or so said Mayor Stillowin. Arya was going to be an aunt soon, which seemed so odd. How could she be an aunt when she had only just left childhood? Arya wondered if it was late enough for supper or if Winifred was merely having a craving that needed to be satisfied. Arya supposed the only benefit to being pregnant was you could eat what you want when you wanted and no one could tell you no. She moved past the giggling Wyler and Beth, past Gendry who was doing his best to ignore the ladies who watched him, and toward the Great Hall. By the time she entered the large room, her mother and Winifred were already seated at the head table. It didn't look like it was quite dinner time, but based on the servants moving throughout the room, she guessed it was close enough. Braavos would be a natural trading partner for the North, Winifred was explaining to her mother. They have the largest trading, fishing, and war fleets in the world. They need a lot of wood to maintain it. Doesn't your grandfather have extensive trade with Braavos? Her mother asked. Yes, but my grandfather's lands aren't rich in trees, not like the Hornwoods, the Umbers, the Glovers, and the Starks. With Braavos he trades mostly silver and wool. Her mother made a noise that Arya knew from experience meant she would think it over. With neither father nor Rob around, she was the one in charge of Winterfell and its surrounding lands. If she wanted to open up trade with Braavos, she had the power to do so, though Arya didn't know what Braavos could offer the North. If she remembered her lessons with Mayor Stillowin correctly, Braavos didn't have much in the way of farmable land. Arya, her mother said, spotting her. How were your lessons? She moved around the table to sit at the seat to her mother's right, a chair occupied by either herself or Rukan, whichever of them arrived to dinner the earliest. Though that was often Rukan, since he was normally in the presence of their mother. Good, Arya answered, knowing her mother wasn't talking about her lessons with Syrio but instead about her lessons with Mayor Stillowin and Septa Mordane, neither of which she had attended that day. Mayor Stillowin went over the history of the Dance of the Dragons. One of the few times she actually found herself interested in lessons, eager to learn more and asking a bunch of questions. She still attended her lessons, as she promised both John and her father that she would, lest needle be taken from her, but they were still so boring. At least the Dance of the Dragons had been interested, what with the fighting and the dragons battling each other. Her mother searched her face for any lies and not finding any, nodding with a soft smile. If Arya skipped her lessons there were plenty of people who could let her know, including Winifred. Pardon my ladies, Mayor Stillowin said as he hurried into the hall, a small rolled-up piece of parchment clutched in his hand. We received a message from Lord Mandaily. What does it say? Her mother asked. Mayor Stillowin bowed low and broke the seal on the letter. He unrolled the message, short though it was, and a pleased smile made its way onto his face. Lord Mandaily writes that the Lady Sansa and some of the Stark household that were in King's Landing, have made it safely to White Harbor. Arya felt the huge smile make its way onto her face, happy that her sister was alive and safe, despite their near-constant fighting. She looked at her mother and saw tears welling in her blue eyes, as she covered her mouth in her hands and made a sound that was halfway between a sob and a laugh. Lord Mandaily is providing them a few days to rest and eat, and will then have them escorted to Winterfell with all haste. He mentions both Veon Pool and Jory Castle by name. Arya felt herself pulled into her mother and hugged tightly. Rather than fight it, as she normally would, she hugged her mother back. Even if she didn't want to, she knew her mother needed this. That is wonderful news, Winifred said, since Lady Catelyn was at a loss of words. For not just House Stark but for those who loved ones went with Lord Eddard and have made it home safely. I'm sure Sir Roderick will be happy to hear his nephew is alive and well. The raven that carried word of Sansa's safety was followed by another raven 5 days later. This one brought with it more joyous news. Arya was playing with Rickon in his room, using his carved wooden toys to pretend they were in the Riverlands with Robb and Jon. It was something they did at least once a se'night for the past several turns of the moon. For Arya it was a way to try to feel close to her two oldest brothers, while also spending time with her youngest. For Rickon it was a chance to play with the only sibling left in Winterfell. Nymeria laid on Rickon's bed, a silent observer to their playing. Rickon had just defeated the Lion of Lannister with his Stark direwolf when her mother found them. "Your brother has broken the siege on Riverrun," her mother explained, smiling down at both Rickon and Arya who sat on the floor before her. "And captured Sir Jaime Lannister. He has already sent word to Tywin Lannister that he will exchange Sir Jaime for your father. If Lord Lannister accepts, your father will be freed and on his way home." Rickon let out a howl of excitement, one that was matched by Shagadog in the Godswood, the direwolf's echoing howl faint and hard to hear. As her brother got up and began to dance around, Arya looked at her mother with questioning eyes. She had two brothers who went to break the siege, and wondered how the other one was. Her mother sensed what question she wanted to know the answer to without it being asked and sighed. "Robb writes that Jon is well, and is the one who captured Sir Jaime." Rickon let out another howl of excitement, and it wasn't just Shagadog who joined him. Arya howled too, and they were all quickly joined by Nymeria. Her and Rickon's howls faded into laughter. "Sansa is coming home, and father will be free," Rickon shouted, doing what Arya could only assume was some type of happy dance. Even her mother, who had been, at best, stoic the past few months, couldn't help but smile and laugh at Rickon's behavior. It was such an improvement on his temper tantrums and sullenness. There was other news in the letter. Arya went with her mother as she found and told Jarell and Lyanna that their mother and older sister were both alive and unharmed from the battles. Winifred and Wyler were told that their uncle had been left at the Twins to guide Lord Karstark's force to Riverrun, so was unharmed, and there was no word yet on if their father was involved in the skirmishes between Roose Bolton and Tywin Lannister. The effect of those two letters on the mood in Winterfell were great. Lessons were more lively as all of the girls were relieved that their loved ones were mostly okay, as they still awaited word on Sir Willis Marndaly. Those who had family that had gone south to King's Landing were hopeful they were one of the survivors who had made it back to the north. Rickon was much happier, and the mood was reflected in Shagadog. While still confined to the Godswood, more people were willing to brave the woods and to even join Rickon in playing with the direwolf, and that included Jarell, Lyanna, and Wyler. There was even talk that with Robb's defeat of one of the Lannister hosts and the Kingslayer captured, that the war would be ending soon. They would exchange the Kingslayer for Lord Eddard Stark, and the armies of the North would turn around and come back home, having accomplished what they set out to do. Arya didn't think it likely if what she had heard of the Lannister armies doing to the Riverland were true. She knew she wouldn't just let something like that go without wanting to inflict the same on those who did it to her. Though she guessed that was for Uncle Edmure to decide. A se'night later a third raven arrived. Arya sat in her lessons with Septa Mordane, surrounded by Beth, Jarell, Lyanna, Wyler, and her mother. She was still trying to finish up a white direwolf she had been working on for the past several days. It was meant to be a gift for Jon on his next Name-a-Day, or at least the next time she saw him, as it was likely to be after his next Name-a-Day, but it was an ugly thing. She hated embroidering, and she hated that she was so bad at it. Even when she put in effort and care to make something, it came out ugly. "Wonderful work," Septa Mordane praised, as she hovered over Lyanna Mormont's shoulder. "Thank you for your kind words," Lyanna murmured, cheeks red. "Your needlework is exceptional, my dear." "Only lady." There was a knock on the door interrupting the Septa's praise. "Come in," Septa Mordane called with a huff. The door was pushed open and Maester Lewin's balding head peeked into the room. "My apologies, my ladies, but Lady Catelyn, we have received a raven." "From whom?" her mother asked, beckoning the Maester into the room. Maester Lewin fully pushed open the door as his eyebrows scrunched in confusion. "It appears to be the crowned stag of House Baratheon, but it is green and gold, not yellow and black." The folded parchment had one of its sides all but covered in dark green wax, the raised parts colored over with gold ink. Arya could not think of any offshoots of House Baratheon that used such coloring, but she would admit she wasn't the best with houses and their sigils. Her mother held up her hands where she held the piece she was working on and her needle, which was threaded with grey thread that sat on her lap. "As you can see, my hands are occupied." Please read it to me. Of course, my lady. With careful fingers, the maester broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. He read the words over, his mouth opening in shock at the words. Her mother looked at the maester in alarm. When Maester Lewin's eyes rose from the parchment and met her mother's gaze, he could only shake his head. Uncaring, her mother dropped what she held to the ground and reached for the parchment. With a trembling hand, Maester Lewin gave it to her. Her mother read over the words herself, a look of horror taking over her face. They have Bran. Chapter 37, Robb X. Robb X. Because it was unknown if the Lannisters would accept their terms for peace, Robb had spent all his free time coming up with moves and counter-moves in the next steps of the war. It would be him against the infamous Tywin Lannister, and Robb would have the benefits of numbers. If the Old Lion decided to settle in for a siege, Robb had plans for that. If the Lannister forces marched out to meet his own or to flee to the Crown Lands, Robb had plans for that. If the Lannister forces split up and marched in different directions, there were plans for that. He had gone over every possible detail he could think of in excruciating detail. 9 days after relieving the siege of Riverrun, which was the day after the Free and Mallister infantry had arrived, Robb was forced to discard all of those plans he had thought up. 2 ravens had arrived at Riverrun and neither bore good news. Dark wings, dark words, as many often said when a raven delivered a message. The first raven was from Tywin Lannister, outright rejecting the terms of their negotiations for peace. He only agreed to one demand, dismissing the others as not even worthy of being contemplated. The man was as arrogant as others made him out to be, and Robb realized if they wanted to force Tywin Lannister to the negotiating table, they needed to do so from a position of strength. Right now the two sides could appear to be on level footing, even though Robb thought his side was in a much stronger position. The second raven was from Lord Jason Mallister, stating he had received word that the Lannisters were raising another host in the Westerlands. A merchant unloading his goods at Seaguard, who had stopped at Lannisport first, had said the Lannisport City Guard were going around recruiting every able-bodied man they could find, those who had been passed over during the first mustering. It would take a moon's turn to gather the men, and another few turns of the moon to turn them into anything resembling a fighting force. But even if it took an entire year, it was not something Robb could allow to happen. Roughly 4,000 men had escaped the Battle of the Camps, as the men were calling the breaking of the siege of Riverrun, and were likely somewhere around Wayfarer's Rest by now. Those men would already be armored, and trained, and would form the core of this new host. If Tywin Lannister would only accept peace on terms the Lords would never agree to, he would need to march on this new host to put them to battle before they became a threat. Otherwise he could find himself between Tywin Lannister and a new fresh host 10 to 15,000 strong. He would be an idiot if he let such a thing happen. In order to move on the new host he had to march west. But it would be unwise to leave only Roose Bolton to keep Tywin Lannister in check, especially given how little cavalry Bolton had available to him. From what he was told, the host under Lord Lannister was a couple of thousand men more than the host commanded by Lord Bolton, and the Lannisters had 10 times as many horses. Robb stood next to his uncles at the front of Riverrun's Great Hall. All of the nobles in Riverrun filled the room, called to discuss the next steps in their war against the Lannisters. Decisions had already been made and plans come up with, but now it was time to inform the other nobles. Tywin Lannister agrees to the exchange of Jaime Lannister for Eddard Stark, Uncle Ed Muir said, to the cheers of the nobles. But that is the only one of our terms he agrees with. The other he does not even attempt to negotiate on. He demands the release of all noble prisoners without ransom or exchange for those of ours he holds captive. He demands every northern and river noble bend the knee and swear fealty to King Joffrey. He demands that our armies march on those of Renly Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon. He refuses to pay any reparations for the damage and death he and his bannermen have inflicted on the Riverlands. The cheers turned to shouts of outrage. Robb let them yell, the Great Jon loudest of them all. After a few moments he finished the last of his ale and banged his cup on the table to call for silence. It took several heavy bangs of the metal cup on the wooden table before the last of the grumblings died down. "My lords," Robb said, rising from his seat. "Tywin Lannister is an arrogant man who thinks he holds a position of strength. He has 18,000 men at Harrenhal, and in the west his bannermen are raising another host 15,000 strong. He thinks us weak, unable to stand against the might of the lions of the west. Lord Lannister forgets that we are the strong currents of the Trident that will pull a lion under its waters just as easily as a man. He forgets that we are the cold winds of winter that will freeze a lion to death just as easily as a man. I say we show him that his position is not as strong as he thinks it is. Fuck the Lannisters. Great Jon shouted. Fuck the Lannisters, others chorused. Robb laid out the basics of his plan, which he had worked on with Uncle Brynden, Jon, and Theon over a pitcher of wine last night. He would lead a force into the west. He would ride out with the cavalry he had already gone to battle with, which included the cavalry of the north, the Freys, and the Mallisters. He would bring with him the infantry of the Freys and the Mallisters, plus 1,000 infantry of rivermen they freed when they ended the siege on Riverrun. With these forces, numbering almost 9,500 strong, he would take the Golden Tooth and Sarsfield, before descending upon the new host the Lannisters were gathering. That would open up the Westerlands to them, to plunder and pillage like the Westermen had done to the Riverlands. The rest of the plan was a little more complicated in how it would work. Uncle Edmure would wait for the Karstark men, who should arrive within the next sennight, and along with the rivermen who continued to gather at Riverrun now that it was free, a number which surpassed 2,000 and would continue to grow while they waited for the Karstarks, would march them east. He would dig in and set up a defensive position between Raventree Hall and Harrenhal, several days' ride from Harrenhal's Folly. Hopefully more men would join him on his march, and by the time he started digging in he would have between 7,000 and 8,000 men. The southern host commanded by Lord Shawnee, which had been discovered by Lord Piper near Acorn Hall marching north to relieve the siege of Riverrun, would turn around and march southeast. The host, whose numbers had swelled since Uncle Edmure had last heard from them and was now composed of close to 10,000 men, including the couple of hundred led by Lord Piper, would cross the God's-Eye River where Tywin Lannister first crossed with his host months before. They would march along the eastern shore of the God's-Eye, doing their best to stay away from travelers on the King's Road, before coming upon Harrenhal from the southeast. Lord Bolton was to move his host from north of the Trident to south of Deari, to act as a deterrent to Tywin Lannister. Given Lord Bolton's smaller numbers, Tywin Lannister would know the flayed man wouldn't besiege Harrenhal, but his presence should give Lannister pause in making any moves, hopefully keeping the lions penned inside their dragon flame-warped cage. Then when Lords Piper and Shawnee approached Harrenhal from the southeast, Uncle Edmure and Lord Bolton would lead their men in from the west and the north, and all three forces would besiege Harrenhal at the same time. From Uncle Edmure's host Uncle Brynden would take several hundred outriders and archers to operate around Harrenhal to prevent any messages from arriving, paying most attention to those coming from the south and east. The hope was the encirclement would happen before Tywin Lannister realized it was happening. They didn't want to give the man a chance to realize he was about to be besieged, thus giving him a chance to flee the castle. It was going to be tricky, but if they could pull it off, they would have close to 31,000 men besieging the 18,000-strong Lannister host. "It's a brilliant plan," Harrenhal said as he approached Robb after the meeting. "But risky and fucking complicated," Smalljon, who trailed behind the Karstark heir, added with the bluntness one expected from a number. "If Lannister catches wind of it, he could easily march on any of the smaller armies and put them to flight." "Aye, he could," Robb agreed. "The plan's success is going to rely on not just the men who will march, but also the fortune of the gods, both old and new." "We don't need the new gods," Smalljon scoffed. "We got the old gods and the blood of the kings of winter." Smalljon patted Robb on his back, and Robb did his best not to stumble forward under the force of the blow. Even in a friendly manner, the Umber heir had enough power in his hand to stagger a man. Robb was a Stark, which meant his blood was old, but it had never been referred to as the blood of the kings of winter before. He knew that was who his ancestors were, all of the Stark children were taught it. That was 3 centuries ago though, and few talked about it outside of history lessons. Harrenhal frowned and looked around them. "This is the land of the new gods, I'll take their help if they're offering it." "I'll agree with that," Robb said with a forced laugh. Inwardly he was terrified that his plan to encircle Tywin Lannister would fail. He was terrified that the Lion of the West would somehow find out and march to crush all 3 hosts in 3 separate battles. If such a thing happened, that would be disastrous no matter how well things went in the West. He couldn't show these fears though. In private, when it was just him, Jon, and Theon, he could let his fears and insecurities show, but in front of the others he had to be the Lord Robb Stark who knew everything would work out exactly as he expected it to. "I will wish you luck on your march," Harry said. "You're not coming with us?" Robb asked, surprised. Harry was a member of his battle guard, who had sworn to protect him in every battle they fought. So far that had been the two, with many more battles ahead of them, and he was already down 2 members. "One of us should be here to tell my father of Eddard," Harry said, bowing his head. "And as the oldest I must shoulder the responsibility." Robb grimaced at the thought of his foster brother and member of his battle guard who had died to defend him from the Kingslayer. Rakard Karstark was a man who loved his sons and could let personal grievances get in the way of everything else. He was afraid of how the man would react to the news. "Of course. Let me know if there is anything I can do, and if it is within my abilities and within good reason, I will do it. Not only are you my foster family, but Eddard gave his life to defend mine. That is something I can never truly repay." "Thank you, Robb. Torren will still ride with you, so if you could look out for him, that would be all I need. I'll be his own personal guard. No harm shall befall him as long as I am there," Robb promised, echoing the words others had sworn to him before their first battle. "If you think your father will need action to process his grief, do not hesitate to have him join us in the west." The more Robb thought about it, the more he realized a grieving Lord Karstark sitting idle in a camp, and then sitting idle in a siege, might not be the best thing. It would let the man stew in his grief. Perhaps killing Lannister men in the Westerlands would ease the thirst for revenge Robb knew he would have. "If he does, I will take command of the Karstark men myself and send him your way." Robb marched out with the men under his command the following day. With Uncle Brynden tasked with keeping Harrenhal blind to their attempts to encircle it, he had put Sir Patrek Mallister in charge of the Outriders and Scouts. Great Jon was given his usual command as the leader of the vanguard, and Black Walder, one of 6 Freys who marched with them, was put in charge of their rearguard. With his army once again consisting of infantry, they moved at a slow pace. Especially with all of the wagons that now made up the middle of his host and extended his lines another couple of miles long, carrying the various supplies an army needed, most of which was food. It would take about a month to march on the Golden Tooth. He was hopeful that Lord Cale Vance, who had risen to his position after his father was killed several miles from the Golden Tooth after the Lannisters first swept in from the west, would add to his strength. The man had retreated with what was left of his father's host, several hundred men, and had holed up in Wayfarer's Rest ever since. Even if the man only offered up 200 to 300 men, it would help boost his numbers, and the keep was on their march into the Westerlands. Like most infantry, the fighting men of the Freys and Mallisters were a couple hundred properly armed and armored men at arms and house guards who carried pikes, spears, swords, and shields. The rest were small folk taken from their fields and fitted with whatever the lords could spare. That meant while a decent chunk of them were given bows and other spears, most of them carried to war the pitchforks, axes, flails, and cudgels they used in the fields. Amongst them, shields were rare and pieces of armor were even rarer. Except these infantry had trailed after 2 battles, the one in the Whispering Woods and the other breaking the siege of Riverrun. The small folk had raided the battlefields, stripping the dead of whatever was left. That meant more of them carried spears, pikes, swords, and shields. And they all seemed to have bits and pieces of armor, a helm here, a breastplate there, many of which were colored red for the Lannister men who first bore the armor. "We'll have to paint them," Theon said, gesturing to a group of infantry near them that all wore at least one piece of red armor. "Otherwise we'll accidentally kill them in the heat of battle." Red was also a color of House Tully, but their men wore armor painted blue to differentiate them from Lannister men. Oliver, who rode just behind Robb, leaned forward on his horse. "We should paint them grey. It's the color House Free and House Mallister share. And the color of House Stark, which was left unsaid since they were rivermen. They would have to find someone who had the necessary materials to recolor the armor for them." Given he expected they'd be collecting even more Lannister armor in the coming weeks, it would make sense to hire someone to travel with the host. They were approaching the Golden Tooth now after 3 weeks of marching. They had passed Wayfarer's Rest 2 days ago, where Lord Vance had ridden out with 500 men to pledge his swords to their mission, leaving behind a garrison of 400 men to defend his home. Ghost and Grey Wind had run ahead with the scouts the day before, and despite not having seen his direwolf in almost a day, Robb knew that Grey Wind was fine. He didn't know how he knew, he just did. "My lords." One of the members of the vanguard, which was a few hours ahead of them, came galloping at them. The chained giant of House Umber was displayed proudly on the center of his surcoat. "My lords," the man shouted again, this time much closer. "My lords, I bring news." "Out with it, man," Theon snapped. "What is this news you bring to us?" "Word from the scouts. The direwolves, they discovered a path into the mountains. Sir Patrek thinks it goes around the Golden Tooth, maybe even Sarsfield." Robb felt his eyebrows lift in surprise, something that was reflected by those around him. A way around the Golden Tooth. If it was true, then the old gods truly favored them. "How sure is he?" Robb asked. The man could only shrug in reply. "Sir Patrek said he sent a few men to scout the path and see where it leads. He said it looks like a goat path used by the small folk. The scouts would be a few hours ahead of the vanguard, with the outriders somewhere in between the two, screening the approach. Ride ahead to Lord Umber and tell him to halt where he is. Let's give Sir Patrek the chance to see where this path leads before we go any further and alert the Golden Tooth to our presence." The Umber man bowed from atop his horse, before turning the beast around and riding ahead. Robb looked at Theon and Jon, both of whom gave him curious looks. "You're already thinking of a new plan," Jon said with a small smile and a shake of his head. "Don't keep us in suspense, what are you thinking?" Theon asked. "If this path passes both the Golden Tooth and Sarsfield, we could take this new Lannister host unprepared. They'd have to be somewhere along the river road between Lannisport and Sarsfield, and wouldn't expect us coming from anywhere but the east. They have to figure they'll get ample warning when we're getting close to them so they can be prepared for our arrival. We'd need to move fast though, to make sure we aren't discovered beforehand." "Just the cavalry again?" Theon asked with a grin. Robb nodded his head as he thought everything over. "Aye. Though it would be foolish to just leave the infantry behind. Maybe they can follow again at their slower pace." "Doubt the wagons can travel a path through the mountains," Theon pointed out. "Aye, and without the wagons there won't be enough to feed everyone." "Have the infantry take the Golden Tooth," Jon said. "And then both forces can meet up again in besieging Sarsfield from both sides." Robb turned to his brother in surprise. "That is a risky move. There's not even 4,000 infantry, depending on the size of the garrison that might not be enough. You have to figure most of the Leford's men are in that castle. Don't take it like a regular siege." "How would you take the Golden Tooth then?" Robb asked, wondering what Jon was thinking. Jon looked ahead of them, where the castle sat beyond their view, a few days' ride still. He then turned to look at their men. He stared at the infantry as if weighing the worth of each man. Jon explained his plan, which caused the eyebrows for both Robb and Theon to go up. Robb had to admit, he was impressed with his brother's thought process. Even Theon nodded his head in approval. It was risky, but if it worked it would limit the casualties they would take. "All right then, if this pass will lead us into the Westerlands proper, then you're in charge of taking the Golden Tooth." Jon slowly blinked at him as Theon sputtered in disbelief. Robb raised an eyebrow at Theon, who looked as if he swallowed something bitter. "I've already told you getting the North and Riverlands to follow an Ironborn will be next to impossible. Besides, it's Jon's plan." Jon rubbed at the back of his head, his face twisted in a grimace. "Are you sure that is wise? Take Smalljon as your second. He respects you and no one will dare go against you with an Umber at your back." Jon bowed his head in acceptance, but the grimace was still on his face. Robb imagined his brother would hold that grimace for the next moon's turn, until the Golden Tooth was in his hands. And even then, he'd still maintain it. Jon didn't realize that noble bastards, while being looked down upon compared to their legitimate kin, held a lot more respect than he realized. Jon would have more respect than any landless knight, and there were plenty of those who lead men into battle. Robb blamed his mother for that. Robb knew he was lucky in his parents, and could not ask for a better mother. He also knew his mother being forced to have her husband's bastard raised right in front of her was an insult. He just wished his mother wouldn't take her feelings out on Jon. Especially after 16 years where Jon had not shown an ounce of the type of vile behavior one often associates with those of bastard birth. It was not his brother's fault he had been born on the wrong side of the sheets. "If that is your wish, I'm going to ride ahead to talk with Smalljon," Jon said. "Go ahead, smallest Jon," Robber responded with a grin. John made a face at him before he spurred his horse into trot and then a gallop. They watched him ride ahead in silence. Rob knew Theon was stewing in his thoughts that John was being given a command while he was not. He would let his friend stew in it for a bit. After a few moments, Rob turned toward the Greyjoy heir. "Fight well in our next few battles and I'll give you your own command." "Truly?" Theon asked, his almost always present smirk making its way back onto his face. "If we take the Golden Tooth and Sarsfield, and defeat this new Lannister host, the Westerlands will be open to us. There will be a lot of undermanned castles and keeps for us to take." Rob figured if things went well he could split his host into 4, each around 2,000 men strong, and have each of them tasked with a keep to capture and towns to raid. If Tywin Lannister wouldn't pay the Riverlands for the damage his armies did to its land and people, then they would exact their price on the Westerlands themselves. His thoughts shifted from the war to home. He wondered what Winifred was doing back in Winterfell. Had the baby already been born? Was there a baby with her dark hair and his blue eyes already screaming its lungs out within the castle walls like he remembered Rickon doing? Hopefully, he would be receiving a raven within the coming Senites with the good news. /N, the Battle of Oxcross should be the last thing that plays out like it does in the books. There are a few more things that parallel the books but aren't the same, similar to Ned's imprisonment by Cersei. Rob has 21,100 men from the north and 18,390 men from the Riverlands. He commands 9,450, 4,900 cavalry, 4,550 infantry, to the west of the Golden Tooth. Roose Bolton commands 14,850 men, 14,300 infantry and 550 cavalry, north of Deari. Ed Muirtully commands 5,190 men, 4,150 infantry and 840 cavalry, who are marching east from Riverrun. Lords Shawnee and Piper command 10,000 men, 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, and are west of the God's Eye marching south. Chapter 38, Sansa 3 and Arya 3. Sansa 3. White Harbor was a clean and well-ordered city, with wide straight cobbled streets that made it easy to walk around. Its houses were built of whitewashed stone, with steeply pitched roofs of dark grey slate. It was the opposite of King's Landing with its narrow streets and buildings all but on top of each other. Though the parts of the capital destroyed in the explosion did not have such a cramped feel to them. White Harbor did not have the population of King's Landing, which meant it did not have the crowds of King's Landing. It lacked the dirt and grime that seemed to cover every inch of the capital. Most importantly, it did not have the smell of King's Landing. One could take a deep breath without fighting the urge to gag. In White Harbor the air was fresh and cold, and smelled of pine and the sea. Lord Marndaly was kind enough to pay the merchants the money owed to them for all of the civilians they had sailed out of Maidenpool. He had assured Sansa that House Stark did not owe him for his generosity, and that it was the least he could do for the daughter of his liege lord. Sansa was sure the man's granddaughter being married to his brother helped ease the burden of such an expense. The civilians would be given jobs and homes in and around White Harbor, as the city and land could always use the extra hands, or at least so Lord Marndaly had said. As for Sansa and the rest of the members of their King's Landing household, he had given them shelter, food, and clothes. Lady, who had not fared well at sea and had spent most of the voyage lying in Sansa's cabin, had been led out of the city and into the surrounding countryside to roam and regather herself. Although she did not think it needed to be said, Sansa made sure to let Lady know in no uncertain terms that she was not to eat any people. Sansa remembered when Lord Marndaly would visit Winterfell, she would often make fun of the hefty man with Jane as he ate more food than any two men and then struggled to rise from his seat. Lord Too Fat to Sit a Horse was only one of many unflattering names she had heard said about the Lord of White Harbor, names she had then said herself when talking about the man with others. She vowed she would never say a bad word about Wyman Marndaly again. Their first night in White Harbor, as they ate a meal better than they had in Senites, they learned that no word had escaped King's Landing on the well-being of her father, not since he had been arrested for treason. The rest of the household left behind had been killed, including Hullen. While that was troubling, news had come from Riverrun, where her brothers had broken the siege on her uncle's keep, and had captured the Kingslayer in the process. Praise was growing for the sons of Ned Stark, or the Young Wolf and White Wolf as the Northern Army had taken to calling Robb and Jon. As he bit into a roasted pheasant, grease dripping down his chin, Lord Mandaly assured her that they would trade the Kingslayer for her father shortly, and he would be heading home soon to be reunited with his family. Yes, I imagine your brother has already sent his request for a prisoner exchange to Lord Tywine, and your father should be heading home within days. After 3 days of rest, it was time to depart White Harbour to head to Winterfell, to head home for the first time in over a year. Sansa stood with Jane, Jory, Harwin, and Sir Barristan at the edge of the harbour. The rest of the servants and guards were loading the supplies being given to them by Lord Mandaly onto the wagons, also provided by Lord Mandaly. "You will not come with us?" Sansa asked Sir Barristan. The old man gave a slow shake of his head. Though almost 60, he was still a knight, though he was one without a place to call his own or a lord to serve. House Stark could give him both, but it seemed the former Lord Commander of the King's Guard had other ideas. "I have been a knight without honor for many, many years. I did not know it at the time, but I lost it long ago, before the reign of the Stag, back when the Mad Dragon sat the throne. It is past time I reclaim what I lost." "Where will you go?" Jory asked. "I will head east across Essos," Sir Barristan said with a resolute look upon his face. "But before we depart from each other, there is something I must do. Jory Castle, in our travels together you have shown courage and wisdom, you have protected the weak, and you have shown yourself quite skilled with a blade." Sir Barristan pulled his sword from its scabbard, and held it out in front of him. "Kneel, Jory Castle." There was stillness amongst the Northerners, as they knew what was being done despite the words not being spoken. Sansa's eyes widened in surprise, and besides her Jane let out a small gasp followed by a wistful sigh. "I do not follow your gods," Jory said as if in a daze, though he lowered himself to his knees despite his words. "While it is true knighthood was intended for those who follow the Seven, honor and justice are the true religion of a knight," Sir Barristan replied. He lowered his sword and placed the tip on Jory's right shoulder. "Jory Castle, do you swear before the eyes of gods and men to defend those who cannot defend themselves, to protect all women and children, to obey your captains, your liege lord, and your king, to fight bravely when needed and do such other tasks as are laid upon you, however hard or humble or dangerous they may be?" "I swear," Jory said, his voice cracking. "Then before the old gods and the new, arise Sir Jory Castle, Knight of Winter and Guardian of the North." Jory climbed to his feet and clasped arms with the legendary knight. Sir Barristan nodded to where Sansa stood. "You will make sure she gets to Winterfell safe and sound?" "As we promised her father." "Aye," Jory said. "Lady Sansa will see Winterfell again, even if the cost is my life." Sansa wished Jory would not say such things, as even the thought of losing someone else she knew made her queasy. Not that she felt there was much to worry about in the north. She often heard the small folk say one could walk from the wall to the neck without running into anyone foul. "Then I leave her in your capable hands." The two men stepped away from each other. Sir Barristan bowed to Sansa. "It has been an honor escorting you home, my lady, though I must apologize to you for departing from your side while the goal is still unfinished." Sansa curtsied in return. "You have done more than enough, Sir Barristan. While not Winterfell, the north is my home, and the honor has been mine in our time together." 9 days later and Winterfell was visible to them as they stopped for supper and to rest for the night. Many of the servants wept at the sight of the castle in the distance, its imposing walls beckoning them into the safety of its embrace. She had to wipe at her own eyes for the tears that came unbidden. Tomorrow she would be home, reunited with her mother and sister and youngest brother. It was not her entire family, but it was more than she had previously hoped to be reunited with, and she knew the others would come back in time. That night Sansa was awakened by Lady licking at her face. She moved her head away from her direwolf and let out an annoyed groan, which Lady answered with a whine. "Lady," she murmured, cracking open one eye to glare. Lady whined again. Sansa closed her eyes again to drift back to sleep, but she thought she heard something. In the distance, faintly heard were bells ringing across the land. No, not just any bells, Winterfell's bells. She had heard them several times before, like when Arya, Bran, and Rickon were born. Winifred had to have been at or very near her due date. She climbed out of her bedroll, wrapping the nightgown she wore tightly around herself to fight off the chill of the night air. Their camp was small and she was easily able to spot Khan, the guardsman who had the first shift of guard duty that night. He stood to the north of their camp and next to him was Jory, Sir Jory she internally corrected, who looked half asleep and disheveled. They stood in silence, gazing in the general direction of Winterfell. "Is it for my niece or nephew?" Sansa asked as she approached the two men, Lady at her side. "Lady Sansa, you shouldn't be up," Sir Jory protested as he turned to look at her. "But I am." She stopped next to the two of them and peered into the darkness, trying and failing to see if she could spot Winterfell with only the moon to light the way. "Are they ringing the bells because Winifred has given birth?" Sir Jory and Khan looked at each other before Jory gave a low shake of his head. "They wouldn't ring it at night," Khan muttered, almost too low for Sansa to hear. "You were born hours before the sun was up. I remember because I was on guard outside of your mother's chambers as she went through hours of labor, but they waited until after people had broken their fast to ring the bells and let the people know of your birth," Sir Jory said. "If they are ringing them this late, then something has happened." Sansa pulled her cloak tighter around herself, fighting the prickling sensation that ran up her arms as the faint ringing of the bells continued. The mournful sound was carried by the wind, cutting through the silence of the northern night. Each chime seemed heavier than the last, laden with sorrow and foreboding. "Jory," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed, "what could it mean? What could have happened to make them ring the bells like this?" Sir Jory's lips pressed into a thin line as he exchanged a look with Khan. His reluctance to speak unnerved her more than she wished to admit. When he finally did, his voice was low and grim. "Bells this late," he began hesitantly, "they are rung to indicate an attacker and, well, for deaths of great importance, lords, kings, or the ruling family of Winterfell." Jory paused and cleared his throat. "I fear, it could mean something has happened to your kin, my lady." Sansa's legs felt unsteady beneath her, her breath catching painfully in her chest. She shook her head. "No," she murmured, her words as much a plea as a denial. "They are safe. My mother is there. Arya and Rickon, they are just children." She trailed off, unable to continue. Sir Jory placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's not certain what it means," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "We'll know the truth tomorrow when we reach Winterfell." Tomorrow. The word echoed in her mind. Morning and the sun's rise suddenly felt an eternity away, and yet she dreaded its arrival, fearing what awaited them within Winterfell's walls. A sinking feeling developed in Sansa's stomach as she shivered from something besides the cold. Next to her, Lady tilted her head back and let out a mournful howl. Arya 3. Being awoken hours before you were accustomed to meant that Arya took a few moments to fully come out of her sleep and enter the land of the living. The only light in her room came from the moon shining through her window, casting shadows that turned her belongings into indistinct shapes. One of those shapes was Nymeria, who stood before the door, hunched low, tail straight. A low, guttural growl emanated from her throat. "What are you doing?" Arya muttered groggily, voice rough with sleep and annoyance. "Go back to bed." Except Nymeria did not so much as flick an ear in acknowledgement. Arya frowned at her direwolf. Despite being more well-behaved than Shaggydoak, Nymeria had a stubborn streak, but this felt like something else entirely. She wondered if mayhaps Nymeria had to go to the bathroom real bad, or maybe one of the stray cats from Wintertown got into the castle again and Nymeria could smell them. That had been an eventful afternoon, if a gruesome one for the poor cat. Arya frowned, the haze of sleep beginning to lift as unease took its place. She climbed out from under the covers and stood from her bed, shivering as her bare feet stepped on the cold stone floor, a chill working its way up her legs. She put a hand on Nymeria's back as she stepped next to her, noticing how tense the direwolf felt. "It's okay," she murmured softly, though it felt more like an assurance to herself than Nymeria. Reaching out, she gripped the iron handle and pulled open the door. The sight that greeted her was barely comprehensible before Nymeria launched herself forward with a snarl. The figure standing in the doorway let out a strangled scream, a sound that turned to gurgling as Nymeria's teeth sank deep into his throat. Something clattered to the ground as the man thrashed wildly, clawing at the direwolf to no avail as blood splattered across the corridor walls. The gruesome sight before her was enough to make Arya feel lightheaded on top of the shock. The man collapsed to the ground, Nymeria still tearing at his throat. Arya took a second to shake herself from her stupor. "Nymeria! Stop!" Arya shrieked, grabbing at her wolf in desperation. She fought to pull the direwolf off the man, whose struggles were already growing weaker, but Nymeria would not allow herself to be pulled away. She thought Nymeria was mauling Galbert, one of the new members of the Stark Guard who they called Bert for short. When she had gone to bed, Bert was the one who had been standing watch over the corridor that led to Arya's room, along with the rooms for Wyler, Jarell, and Lyanna. The torchlight flickering in the hallway offered a clearer view of the man, and Arya's panic ebbed momentarily as confusion took its place. He was not wearing Stark armor, as all guards did while on duty. His face was not one she could recall ever laying eyes on, and she remembered most everyone she saw. This was no guard of Winterfell but an unfamiliar man clad in plain leather. As realization dawned, Arya stepped out into the corridor and spotted Bert, Galbert, slumped near the hall's entrance, his lifeless body crumpled against the cold stone. His armor gleamed faintly in the torchlight. While she had never before seen a dead body, there was no mistaking the emptiness of his unblinking gaze. Arya's breath hitched. Her confusion deepened as fear clutched at her chest, and without thinking, she screamed, a piercing cry that echoed down the stone hallways of Winterfell. But her scream was not the only one that echoed throughout the castle. From the floor below, where her brother's rooms were, that were now only occupied by Rickon and Winifred, echoed not one but two screams. One sounded like fear, the other pain. 3 doors flew open around Arya, and Wyler, Lyanna, and Jarell emerged, their faces pale and eyes wide with shock. Jarell held her mace in a white-knuckled grip, her knuckles almost as pale as her face. All 3 froze as their gazes fell on the blooded, lifeless man and Nymeria, her muzzle stained with crimson, who still had her teeth buried in the man's neck. Lyanna breathed out, hand going to her mouth as she took in the sight. Nymeria stepped back from the body at last, growling low as she padded toward Bert's corpse, sniffing briefly before lowering her head in a mournful whine. Nymeria sat back on her haunches as the sound of heavy footfalls approached, the clank of armored men filling the corridor. While it was hard to see Nymeria, Arya could tell her direwolf was not as tense as she had been earlier, which made her think the footsteps approaching were friendly. 4 Stark guards rounded the corner, led by Hal, the newly appointed head of the guard in Jory's absence. Hal's normally calm expression turned grim as he took in the scene, the blooded figure, Bert's body, and Arya standing in the middle of it all with her small form trembling in the dim light. "Lady Arya," Hal called, hurrying past Nymeria despite a wary glance at the wolf's blooded muzzle. His boots slid slightly on the slick stone floor, but he steadied himself and knelt in front of Arya. His tone softened, his expression was full of concern. "My lady, are you hurt?" he asked. Arya could only shake her head, her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to protest that she was not a lady, like she did every time they referred to her as one, but the words would not come. Instead she pointed toward the intruder's corpse. For the first time she noticed the dagger that lay near the body as she remembered something clattering to the ground after Nymeria's attack. Was that man going to use that dagger on her? What? She licked her lips. What is happening? "Intruders, my lady. 3 of them are dead on the floor below. I must keep moving up, to check on your lady mother." Hal stood and gestured to one of the other guards. "Stay here." The man nodded as Hal and the 3rd guard moved back to the way they came, to the stairs and to the floor above them where her mother's rooms would be. Wyler stepped closer to Arya, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Arya, are you sure you're not hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling but kind. "I'm fine," Arya finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to the guard left with them, whose name she did not remember. "How are Rickon and Winifred? Are they all right?" "Yes, my lady. Your brother's direwolf and your sword master kept them safe. Though it appears the stress of the situation has sent Lady Winifred into labor. Maester Lewin has been sent for." Despite her heart still beating fast from the fear of earlier, Arya could not help but feel some giddiness building up inside herself. If the gods were kind, she would be an aunt in several hours' time. "Can I go to them?" she asked. The guard thought it over before shaking his head. "This is an easily defensible position." The guard gestured to the single corridor that led to their rooms. "I think it best we stay here until the keep is cleared. The rest of the guards are being awoken, and they will search every inch of the castle until all of the intruders are rooted out." "But Winifred," Wyler started to say. "We'll still be there in the next few hours," the guard assured them. Arya had heard some of the horrors of giving birth, and knew that Winifred surviving the next few hours was never a guarantee. Yet she did not argue with the man. She knew once her mother found out Winifred was in labor, she would go to Winifred's room whether the guards wanted her to or not, and Arya knew her mother would let her tag along. They settled into a few moments of silence. Lyanna approached Nymeria and tentatively scratched the top of the direwolf's head. Jarell leaned against the wall, mace still held tightly within her grasp. And Wyler stood near Arya, providing silent support in case she needed it. There were muffled shouts coming from the staircase. Shouts that were getting louder and accompanied by armored footsteps. Mayor Stillowin. That was Hal's voice, calling out with noted panic. Someone get Mayor Stillowin. Lady Caitlin has been stabbed. Before anyone could stop her, Arya ran down the corridor to the stairs. She darted under the arms of the guard meant to watch her, who swung wildly to stop her. Shouts of Lady Arya, and Arya, followed behind her, but she did not care. As she ran up the steps as fast as she could, the bells of Winterfell started to chime. Bong. 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 Chapter 39, Ned 11 and Bran 4. Ned 11. The moon had waxed and waned 3 times and was halfway through a 4th cycle since Ned had been confined to his room in the Maiden Vault. Locked in the chambers as he was, he found his biggest foe to be boredom. There was only so much entertainment one could get from gazing out a window, and he had reached his limit within the first week. The comet had provoked deep thought with its appearance. What did it mean and who was the omen for? But it had soon vanished from the sky, first the day and then the night. His thoughts drifted often to his family. Had Sansa made it safely back to the north? He trusted Sir Barristan and Jory to see her home, but the land was at war and Cersei would not allow his daughter to escape so easily. How were Robb and Jon doing leading armies and fighting battles? War was never something he wanted his children to see, let alone fight in, and though he trusted the 2 of them, that did not mean he was not worried about them. Was Bran safe in his travels with Sir Robert? Last he had heard they were in the Reach near Old Town, far away from the fighting in the Riverlands, and he hoped it stayed that way. Was Arya's sword training teaching her the patience she lacked? While he loved Arya dearly, his daughter needed to temper her wolf blood lest she go the way of his sister. What of Rickon? Did his son even know who he was anymore? Ned had been gone over a year, during some of the most important years of Rickon's life, and it would not surprise him if his youngest did not recognize him should they meet again. And what of Cat? This was the longest they had been separated since he had marched off to war shortly after they had wed in Riverrun. They had been strangers then, married to honor an agreement made by a dead father for the hand of a dead brother. Ned had stepped up, doing the honorable thing, even if it meant scorning a woman he had loved. Over the years together he had grown to love Cat and she him. He yearned for her in a way he did not think he would ever have felt about her all those years ago. He missed playing with her hair as they lay in bed together. He missed the way her blue eyes would gaze into his own and the world around them would fade away. Thoughts of the family that is drifted to thoughts of the family that was. Of a loving mother who died of illness while he was in the Vale. Of a stern father who fostered him hundreds of miles away and died by wildfire at the hands of a mad king. Of a wild brother, always the center of attention, who choked to death trying to save their father. And of an equally wild sister who indirectly started a war that killed thousands and died in a pool of blood. Promise me, Ned. Promise me. Although there was not much space, he did his best to keep himself fit as a way to distract himself from his own thoughts. Being stagnant for so many months would mean his body would waste away, he'd lose muscle, and would either get thin or fat, depending on how much the Lannisters continued to feed him. Though keeping fit proved difficult with his lame leg preventing him from doing anything strenuous. Even something as simple as walking the space around the bed was a grueling task without his cane. Yet he persisted in his efforts, for he lacked anything else to do. Within the first few weeks of his confinement he had been visited by Sir Jacelyn Bywater. The Lord Commander of the Gold Cloaks was outraged that he had been duped with a Littlefinger started riot on the day of Ned's capture. He had pledged to free Ned from not just the Maiden Vault but the city proper. "I have 500 loyal men," Sir Jacelyn had vowed to him. Each of them ready to fight. If there was one thing Ned remembered, it was loyal men. He remembered William Dustin, Ethan Glover, Theo Vull, Martin Castle, and Mark Riswell. He remembered Wyl and Fat Tom and Volley. They visited his dreams often, a handful of the hundreds of faces that visited, a reminder of his failures to the loyal men sworn to him. No, he had whispered, bowing his head. Enough loyal men have died for me. No more. My lord. Do not put your lives in danger for my own. Besides which, your plan is likely well known by both Baelish and Varys. They will be prepared, the men under you will be killed or imprisoned, and all you have planned will be for naught. What would you have us do? Your duty to the people of this city. Sir Jacelyn had conceded to Ned's point and did not make any attempts to free Ned. He did post loyal men outside his doors, who passed along whatever rumors and information they had. It was how he knew Sansa had escaped the city and was spotted near Sow's Horn. That is until someone, who Ned suspected was Tyrion Lannister, must have realized the Gold Cloaks were providing him with information because they were eventually replaced by Lannister men. There was a knock on his door before it was pushed open and Tyrion Lannister entered the room. Ned hasn't had any proper visitors since the last time Lord Tyrion had visited him several nights ago. The smaller man wrinkled his nose as the smell of the room hit him. It had been a while since Ned had properly bathed. There was only so much one could do with a bucket of lukewarm water and a piece of soap. I think a bath once a night would be for the best. At least for the sake of anyone visiting you. To what do I owe the honor of your presence? Ned asked, ignoring the comment. My father has never been proud of me, Tyrion said as he climbed into the chair by the door. I was born a dwarf and killed my mother in the process. When I was a babe, he had my chambers in one of the deepest parts of Casterly Rock. The only ones I saw until I was 5 were my nursemaid and my brother before he left to become a squire. I hate my father. I started to drink and whore because it was the only way to get him to look at me, really look at me, even if it was in disgust. Tyrion was not looking at Ned while he spoke. Instead he stared at a spot on the wall several feet to Ned's left. Was there a point to the imp's rambling? Yet when the opportunities presented themselves I always did everything in my power to make him proud. He assigned me to oversee the Seals of Casterly Rock. No doubt he meant it to insult me, but I took to it with a gusto and those seals never flowed so well. He had me negotiate trade deals with the Ubber and the Lannisters never made as much profit on trade as we did those years. Is there a point to this? Ned asked as Lord Tyrion took a pause in his talking. Tyrion shook his head and looked at Ned for the first time since entering the room. I have news. News that I am sure will make any father proud of his sons. A feeling I have never known. Tyrion sighed, exhaling years of neglect and abuse. Your sons fooled my father. They sent their infantry down the King's Road to make my father think the entire northern army was giving battle. In reality it was a diversion. Their cavalry crossed at the Twins. They broke the siege of Riverrun and captured my brother in battle. Tyrion was right as Ned felt himself swell with pride. To think that Robb and Jon, who were only 16 years old, were able to not only outwit the Old Lion, but recapture the Kingslayer in the process. He knew Tywin Lannister's reputation was based more on fear and reputation than actual military command, but this was more than he could have hoped. How could he not be proud of the two of them? I have always been proud of Robb and Jon. Yes, I imagine so, Tyrion said, a sad smile making its way onto his face. They have already sent terms for peace, including an exchange of you for Jaime. Of course my father has rejected them because the terms do not have the Lannisters coming out as the undisputed winners in the conflict, and he will accept nothing less. I, however, will make sure an exchange of you and my brother goes through, regardless of the other terms. I am the acting hand of the king, Aftra. Ned remembered the Kingslayer's skill as he cut through Ned's guard, even after hours of manual labor had robbed him of much of his strength. He remembered the man's poor temperament and anger. It would benefit his son none to have such a man opposite them on the battlefield again, even if that meant Ned's own freedom. I don't want to be freed, Ned said. Leave me here. Tyrion's eyebrows raised in surprise. Well, that's a first. Be that as it may, I will see it done. Your brother. My brother loves me, Tyrion interrupted, voice harsh. He's the only one who has ever done so. No matter what you claim, no matter what you wish, I will see him freed. Exchanging you for him is the best way to see that done. Though, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that part of the reason I wish to see you free is for Jon Snow's benefit. He is a friend after all. Ned grunted but did not rise to the bait Tyrion was trying to dangle in front of him. He had been the one to send Jon with Lord Tyrion on his journey to Castle Black. Any friendship that existed between the two of them was of Ned's own doing. Instead he decided to change the topic. Did you return that book to Maester Lewin? I have not. It slipped my mind. Please see to it that you do return it to him as soon as possible. I figure you out of anyone else in this wretched city understand the importance of a well-stocked and organized Maester's library. Tyrion frowned. A heavy silence hung in the air between them. After a moment, Tyrion leaned forward in his chair. What is it you want me to see? Tyrion asked. While he hadn't said it outright in his letter all those moons ago, Jon appeared as fond of Tyrion as the dwarf appeared to be of Jon. The imp's intelligence and wit were two things Jon noted in his letter, two things Ned hoped the man truly had in spades. He could just come out and say it, but he needed the man to see with his own eyes what his sister and brother had done. And when it was found out that Ned knew the terrible secret, there was no way Cersei would allow him to go free. Any thoughts of exchanging him for the Kingslayer would go out the window. He looked at Tyrion in his mismatched eyes. The truth. Bran 4. The march to Storm's End was a far more grueling affair than the march to Bitterbridge had been. The pace was relentless, a desperate urgency hanging over the men of the Reach and the Stormlands like a storm cloud. But it was not just exhaustion that made the journey miserable. It was the knowledge that it had all been a lie. That every kind word, every assurance of safety, every promise of honorable treatment had been hollow. From the moment he had stepped foot again into Highgarden, he had been nothing more than a well-kept hostage. Bran had suspected something was amiss when they had been denied leave to ride north toward the Riverlands, but he had not fully grasped the truth until that moment in the command tent when the words had been spoken. They would march south, not north, and accompany Renly Baratheon to Storm's End to break his brother's siege. The moment had been surreal, a slow, dawning horror that left him too numb to argue as he was escorted back to his tent. His life for guarantees that the North and the Riverlands would not act against Renly in his quest to be king, including pledging loyalty to Stannis. Bran had barely noticed his surroundings, his mind spinning with thoughts of home, of his siblings, of Winterfell so very far away. But all of that had been shoved aside the instant he noticed something missing. Summer was gone. He had known this would happen. Had known, in the back of his mind, that they would never allow him to keep a direwolf at his side, not when they meant to use him as leverage. And yet, the knowledge did nothing to dull the ache in his chest when he saw the empty space where Summer should have been. His first thought had been that they had killed him, that they had taken his wolf while he was off finding out the truth, and ended him before Bran could fight back. The rage that thought had inspired had been blinding, the sharpest emotion he could ever remember feeling. But it had only been temporary because deep in his heart, he knew. Summer was alive. Somewhere out there, in the lands of the Reach, his direwolf still roamed. He could not say how he knew, he just did. Sir Robar had noticed his distress but said nothing, offering only a solemn nod before retreating to his own duties. Like Sir Robar, Bran now barely spoke with the Reach knights assigned to watch over him. Sirs Reynaud, Humphrey, and Adam were courteous enough, but Bran did not trust them. He answered their questions with as few words as possible, giving them nothing beyond what was required. Many times growing up he had watched Jon sulk through Winterfell with a sour demeanor, snapping at anyone who came near when he was in one of his moods. Bran felt like he could finally understand how Jon felt in those moments. Each night, Renly met with his commanders, Lord Tarly, Lord Merryweather, and Lord Rowan, along with Sir Garth Tyrell and Sir Loras Tyrell. Their discussions carried late into the night, their voices a low murmur beneath the flapping of banners and the crackling of campfires. Sir Robar had explained that no true strategy could be decided upon until they had more information on Stannis' host. They needed numbers, terrain, and positioning, but the discussions continued nonetheless, a constant preparation for whatever lay ahead. Lord Randyll Tarly, according to Robar, was among the greatest military minds in Westeros. The only man to win a significant victory for the Targaryens during Robert's rebellion, defeating Robert himself at the Battle of Ashford. Lord Tully's military acumen was so highly thought of that the only other commanders considered his equal were Stannis Baratheon, Tywin Lannister and, much to Bran's surprise, his own father. That knowledge filled him with an odd mixture of pride and sorrow. His father had been respected even by his enemies, and yet his father could do nothing against his own arrest for treason. 3 nights passed before Storm's End finally came into view. It loomed against the horizon, its curtain walls 100 feet high, an impenetrable fortress standing defiant against the waves. The encirclement around it was faint at this distance, little more than a blur of banners and movement. Beyond the castle, in the sea that lapped against the castle walls, dozens of ships bobbed in the water. Although he could not make out the banners of Stannis' camp or the sails of the ships, the colors were the same. Lord Stannis was the master of ships for King Robert, Sir Robar explained as they observed the scene. He had, and appears to have kept, the loyalty of many of the captains within the fleet. A fleet meant supplies. A fleet meant reinforcements. If Stannis could hold out long enough, if the siege could not be broken, then Renly's forced march would have been for naught. The lack of their own supplies had already begun to show. Men went out into the nearby woods to hunt every evening, as others moved to forage whatever berries and edible roots they could find. Most of the baggage train had been left behind with the infantry at Bitterbridge, along with the vast majority of tents. Lords and heirs still had shelter, but they were smaller, barely more than what a man-at-arms might use. And as hostages, Bran and Sir Robar received even less. They had bedrolls, at least, but nothing more. Their usual placement in camp was close to where Renly and his commanders gathered, but far enough away that several guards stood between them and the self-proclaimed king. It was a quiet, isolated existence most nights. Bran had been preparing for dinner when the commotion started. A distant uproar carried across the encampment, shouts rising near the edge of the camp facing Stannis' position. He couldn't make out the words, but he could see movement, figures gathering, urgency rippling through the ranks. Then Renly's voice rose above the rest, sharp with protest. "What are they shouting about?" Bran asked, turning to Sir Robar. "It sounds like they are saying parley." Bran frowned, trying his best to remember the teachings of his father and Sir Roderick. "Parley? That means talking, right?" Sir Robar nodded. "It means the leaders of both armies meet to discuss potential terms to avoid battle. Likely, Stannis wants to convince Renly to see reason as the younger brother. Do you think it will work?" Sir Robar's answer was short and firm. "No." And he was right. Word spread through camp that Renly had declined the parley. As the night stretched on, the tension in the camp thickened. Sir Robar did not know how Renly expected to win this battle. He had left his infantry behind, relying almost entirely on cavalry. Against an enemy entrenched with a strong infantry line, the advantage would be slim. A solid infantry line set with pikes and spears can not only withstand a cavalry charge, Sir Robar murmured, it can slaughter one. Bran listened, absorbing the lesson but understanding little of what it might mean for the day to come. He suspected he would soon find out. Sleep did not come easily that night. And when it did not last. Screams tore through the camp. Bran jolted awake, heart hammering as he sat up. The guards posted near them had stirred as well, shifting into action as shouts rang out across the camp. Footsteps thundered past their resting place, men rushing toward the command tents. Sir Adam rose swiftly, the others following at a slower pace. "I'll go see what's happened," he muttered before disappearing into the night. Bran, Sir Robar, and the others waited in tense silence. The minutes dragged into what felt like an eternity before Sir Adam returned, his face grim. "There was an attack," he said, voice low. "An assassin." The words sent a chill through Bran. "An assassin?" Sir Humphrey echoed, still groggy with sleep. "Did they catch him? Was anyone killed?" Sir Reynard demanded. Sir Adam's jaw tightened. "Lord Tully, Lord Merryweather, and Lord Rowan are dead." He hesitated, as if debating whether to continue. "His Grace and Sir Loras claim the assassin was a shadow." "A shadow? They must have seen things in their grief." "What of the battle?" Sir Humphrey asked, worried. "Sir Garland urges his Grace to fall back to a more secure position and to summon the infantry. He does not think it wise to give battle." His Grace refuses and will continue with the battle tomorrow. Come Bran, it is not for us to worry about a cause not our own, Sir Robar said, leading Bran back to their bedrolls. Bran wanted to hear more of this shadow but did as Sir Robar wished. As he laid down, Sir Robar leaned in close. The knight looked briefly over his shoulder before turning back to Bran and speaking in a low voice. Depending on how tomorrow's battle goes, he whispered, there might be an opportunity for us to escape. Keep alert. If I tell you to run, do not hesitate. Do you understand? Bran swallowed hard. Then, with barely a breath, he whispered, I understand. Chapter 40, Jon 9. Jon 9. Jon shifted his weight just enough to avoid the thrust aimed at his chest, letting the blade slide against the side of his breastplate with a scraping sound that mingled with the panicked cries of the women huddled against the far wall. He stepped into his opponent's reach and slammed the pommel of his sword into the man's helm. The master-at-arms of the Golden Tooth, as Jon assumed the man was, crumpled to the ground and made no move to get up. Jon exhaled, steadying his heartbeat as he turned his attention to Lady Alysanne Lefford. The young woman's back was pressed against the far wall, her golden hair disheveled, her pale face twisted in terror. She was the last surviving Lefford of note in the Golden Tooth, her father having drowned during the Battle of the Camps. Her body trembled as Jon pointed his sword at her. Your castle is in the hands of House Stark now, Lady Lefford, he declared, his voice measured but firm. On my honor, no harm shall befall you as long as you do not seek to harm us. Her wide, blue eyes darted to the unconscious master-at-arms, then back to Jon. She clenched her jaw, clearly struggling between anger and fear, but she said nothing. Jon had little time to dwell on it. His plan to take the Golden Tooth had unfolded almost perfectly. Amongst their own infantry they had found enough pieces of red armor from fallen Lannister men-at-arms to dress 23 men. Of those, only Smalljon Umber and Jon himself were Northmen. The rest were Rivermen led by Steffon Frey, chosen specifically because they did not speak with northern brogues that would betray them. With nerves on edge, they had split from Robb's forces after leaving the Mountain Goat Path, and traveled east on the river road. They had passed Sarsfield, fearful of being discovered, and approached the Golden Tooth from the west, pretending to be more men sent from Casterly Rock to help fend off the savage northerners. Their deception had worked. Alysanne had welcomed them, desperate for aid against what she believed to be a 10,000-strong northern host. The timing had been fortunate as well. The 4,000 Lannister men who had retreated from Riverrun had encamped outside the Golden Tooth for a se'night, but they had been ordered to Oxcross to reinforce the new army assembling there. They had not passed those 4,000 men when heading east on the river road, so they were likely already at Oxcross. Yet he could not dwell on that. That was a problem for Robb to worry about and overcome, not Jon. That had left Lady Lefford with only 400 defenders, a force far too small to withstand a siege. The garrison had welcomed the supposed reinforcements with open arms, even despite their small numbers. That very night, Jon and his men had moved swiftly, cutting their way through unsuspecting guards as they made their way to the eastern gates. Raising a portcullis was not a silent affair. The rattling chains and grinding iron drew the attention of men along the battlements. Shouts of betrayal rang out, but by then it was too late. The gates were theirs. The real test had come when the gate was opened. Jon had concentrated on Ghost, mentally willing the direwolf to understand that the gate had been opened and he needed to alert their army to charge the castle. As he told the commanders, Ghost would give them a signal, much to their disbelief. He need not have worried. Before he could even fully think of his direwolf, the first wave of Free and Mallister infantry were already surging forward, their cries of battle echoing through the canyon. The Lefford men-at-arms met the charge as best they could, considering they were outnumbered 10-1. The narrow passage through the gatehouse became a slaughterhouse, the ground slick with blood. The fiercest resistance had come at the keep's entrance, where Jon and Smalljon led the charge. The defenders fought fiercely, but the battle had been decided the moment the gates fell. Jon had become separated from his men in the chaos, but the old gods must have been guiding his feet. He had found a door guarded by 2 men and knew he had stumbled upon something important. A quick strike and then a overhead fake had seen them dead, one after the other, and he found himself entering the private chambers of Lady Lefford herself. Now, after knocking out her protector, he contemplated what the best course of action was. He could lead Lady Lefford from the room and hope they did not come across any more of her men before getting to the courtyard, or stay where they were and hope it was John's men who found them first. The quiet contemplation was short-lived. Ghost burst into the room, his muzzle red with blood and eyes glowing in the torchlight. Lady Lefford screamed anew, scrambling against the wall as if she could somehow vanish into the stone itself. Ghost did not even look at the frantic woman as he padded up to John's side and sat on his haunches, tongue lolling out of his mouth. With a steel-garbed hand, John reached out and scratched behind Ghost's ear. Behind Ghost came Smalljan, Black Walder Free, and a dozen free infantry. The sight of them made John's stomach tighten. "There you are," Smalljan said, relieved. "I was worried when we got separated, but you seem to have done well for yourself." His gaze flickered to Lady Lefford, then to the unconscious master-at-arms. A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. John ignored the amusement in Smalljan's voice. He turned to Black Walder, face grim. "Try to control the men," he said. "I won't deny them their loot, but I'd prefer none of them lower themselves to rape or senseless killing." Although none of his father, Maester Lewin, or Sir Roderick ever went into details about what happened after a besieged castle or city was captured, Great John did not adhere to such things. He told John all about the brutality that took place during a sack. Men would fall into their lesser instincts and would loot, rape, and kill for hours until satiated. Oftentimes the chance to loot, and to a lesser extent rape, were the biggest draw for the small folk to fight in wars like this. Men who commanded respect, love, or fear, or some combination of the three might be able to control their armies and make sure they behaved well after taking a castle or city, but John was not one of those men. If the majority of these men were Northmen John was leading, men who were loyal to House Stark and him by extension, he would be stricter in his attempt to limit raping and killing by punishment of taking the black for any he caught, but these were not Northmen. Robb had put him in command of Rivermen, with only a small retinue of Northerners, who owed the bastard of a faraway house no such allegiance. Black Walder let out a scoffing chuckle. "You heard the White Wolf," he said to the men behind him. "Limit the raping and killing." His tone was flippant, mocking. John's grip on his sword tightened, his jaw clenched. John did not know if he was a better swordsman than Black Walder, but at that moment he was itching to find out. He took a breath and reined in his temper as best he could. Lady Lefford was still watching him, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the fabric of her gown so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. He took another slow breath and sheathed his sword. "Lady Lefford, you will stay in this room. We will set a guard outside to make sure you do not leave, but also to keep you safe." He turned his glare back to Black Walder. "Set 2 men outside her door. Men you trust. Make sure they understand that if anything happens to Lady Lefford, if she is so much as touched, they along with whoever is responsible will be fed to Ghost." At his side, Ghost bared his teeth in a silent snarl to enforce the seriousness of John's threat. Black Walder's smirk faltered. He eyed the direwolf warily before nodding. "Aye, as you say." John didn't believe him, not entirely, but for now it would have to do. The Golden Tooth was theirs. By the time dawn broke over the horizon, they had an accounting of their dead. 217 men who had perished under John's command, including Petter Free, called Petter Pimple by his family. Only 2 years older than John himself, the pimple-covered teen left behind a young daughter. He should have stayed at the twins, Black Walder had said with a shrug upon news that his younger brother was dead. At least John knew the man's flippant attitude did not just extend to him but apparently almost all those around him, including kin. John's squire, Brian Free, showed more emotions at the death of his cousin. The boy's hands curled into fists at his sides, his face drawn in grief. "Petter was a good man," he murmured. "One of the few at the twins. He was no warrior." While Brian disagreed with Black Walder's aloof attitude toward his brother's death, he did agree with his statement. Petter Free should have stayed at the twins, and away from the fighting. They had another 200 or so wounded. John placed them in the care of the castle's maester and servants, under the watchful eye of a few men to ensure there was no foul play. Masters swore oaths to serve the realm and be impartial, but only a fool would trust an oath alone. Maesters often came from the noble ranks, and while they dropped their last name upon forging a chain, old loyalties were like a weed, often rooted too deep to ever effectively get rid of. The defenders of the Golden Tooth had suffered fewer deaths but many more wounded. John made sure they received care as well, unwilling to let them rot or succumb to their wounds needlessly. Those who had survived and remained uninjured were stripped of their arms and armor. The small folk among them were sent back to their homes and lands, while the remaining men at arms, including the castle's master at arms, were locked away in the dungeons until a better solution could be determined for them. The plan was to rest for a few days and then march on to meet with Robb and besiege Sussfield, encircling the keep between the two forces. He would give command of the Golden Tooth to one of two Freys he commanded that he trusted, Steffon, who he found better company than his older cousin, Black Walder. With Steffon he would leave 200 able-bodied men, and the wounded, to hold the castle. The morning they were set to depart, the chill of dawn clung to the air when a rider from Riverrun arrived bearing urgent missives. His horse was lathered, and his face was drawn with weariness from hard riding. In his hands, he carried 2 letters. One bore the seal of House Tully, its leaping trout pressed into blue wax. The second had been broken open once before, its green wax barely visible beneath the grey wolf's head of House Stark. John took the letters, his brow furrowed. It was not his place to open Robb's messages, he was well aware of that, but the urgency in the rider's eyes gave him pause. Small Janumba loomed at his side, arms crossed over his broad chest. Lord Tully wouldn't have sent word if it wasn't important, Small Jan grunted. Robb can't read letters he won't see for another se'night. Best to know what's in them now. John hesitated a heartbeat longer, then broke the seals. The first letter was the one from Lord Edmure Tully. Rickard Karstark had arrived at Riverrun with his banners, his own men and the rough mountain clans from the far north, men more accustomed to fighting wildlings than Southron knights. The news of his son Eddard's death had reached Rickard within hours of his arrival. That night, grief had driven him to murder. The letter detailed how Lord Karstark and a handful of his most loyal men had slain the Tully guards in the dungeons and butchered Cleos Free, son of Aemon Free and Jenna Lannister, who had been a prisoner under Riverrun's protection. John's mouth pressed into a hard line. He could picture it all too well, the Karstark lord, his face filled with grief, killing in the dead of night with vengeance burning in his heart. But vengeance could shatter alliances as easily as swords. Lord Edmure had no choice but to imprison Rickard and his accomplices, a decision that nearly saw Karstark men drawing steel. It was feared that Northmen and Rivermen would slaughter each other then and there. Only Harry on Karstark's intervention had prevented bloodshed. Both Edmure and Harry on had agreed to let Lord Karstark sit in the dungeon of Riverrun, in the very cell Cleos Free had been killed in, until Robb returned and passed judgment on him for his actions. They moved forward with the plan to march toward Harrenhal the next day so as to get the Northmen far from the castle lest they think to try to free Lord Karstark and fracture an alliance that was being put to the test, but the letter warned of high tension simmering just beneath the surface between the north and the Riverlands. John exhaled slowly. Both Robb and Harry on had suspected Lord Karstark would be struck by a need for vengeance but neither could have predicted the means he would go to achieve it. Now, Robb would have to balance justice and loyalty, punishment and alliance. It was a near impossible task. Decide too much in favor of one side and you risk alienating the other. A lesser man would falter. His brother could not afford to. It was the second letter that made John's blood run cold. Renly Baratheon wrote in flowery, courteous language that Bran had sought his protection at Highgarden, and was in his care as a ward, to be protected and cared for during these troubled times until such a day when the boy could be safely returned to Winterfell. The words dripped with false kindness. Beneath Renly's signature, Maester Lewin's neat, cramped script carried the real message. Renly has declared himself king. He is backed by the Reach. John stared at the letter, reading it twice to be certain. A ward. Theon Greyjoy was called a ward too, but John knew what his brother really was. Bran was a hostage, plain as day. A human shield to keep the forces of the North, and by extension the Riverlands, from ever acting against Renly on their own or in the service of another who claimed to be king. And then if Renly won, Bran would use to force House Stark to bend the knee. John's hands clenched around the parchment, crumpling it before he caught himself. This had been meant for Robb, not him. He smoothed the letter out with stiff fingers, though the paper remained creased and battered. Bran. His little brother, who had dreamed of being one of these southern knights. who had returned from being away in the Vale for half a year as a squire for Sir Robar and had smiled with his whole face when he had been greeted by Rob and Jon as soon as he entered Winterfell, all those moons ago. Held captive by a man who called himself king. Jon strode to Lady Lefford's Solar, the missives tucked under his arm. He penned a third letter to Rob in a tight, careful hand, apologizing to his brother for what he had to do, before sealing it with the gold wax of House Lefford. When he finished, he pressed his thumb against the warm wax and closed his eyes for a moment. By midday, the host gathered outside the western gate, over 4,000 men, their banners rippling in the cold wind. Mostly infantry, with 100 cavalry at best. They stood in loose formations, waiting only on Jon to give the order to march on Sarsfield. Jon rode out to meet them, the 3 letters clutched tightly in his hand. He reined in his horse before the cavalry, his dark eyes scanning the gathered men before pointing to 2 riders. "You ride ahead and take these to Lord Robb Stark. The news is urgent, and he must see it at once." The men took the letters with curt nods, spurring their horses down the road at once. Jon watched them go, then turned back to the assembled men. The words that came next sat heavy on his tongue, but he knew he had no choice. "I cannot join you on this march." A murmur spread through the ranks. Smalljon's booming voice cut through it like a cleaver. "What the fuck are you talking about?" Jon's mouth was a hard, thin line. "Renly Baratheon, with the backing of the Reach, has declared himself king. He's taken my brother Bran as a hostage." Black Walder Frey snorted, his sharp face twisted in amusement. "You plan to fight your way through the Reach, is that it? They can field 100,000 men. You're a teenager and a dog." Ghost bared his teeth at the insult. He was already larger than a wolf, and Jon suspected there was still more room to grow. "I'm not looking to fight 100,000 men," Jon said, his voice cold and steady. "I'm going to find Bran, and if I can get him out, I will. Or you'll get him killed," Black Walder sneered. "But do what you want. He's not my brother." Jon's jaw clenched. He thought of how quickly Black Walder had dismissed Petter Pimple's death days before. He bit back the retort that burned on his tongue. "You're not going alone," Smalljon declared, stepping forward. Jon opened his mouth to protest, but the Umber scowled down at him. "Shut your brooding mouth, smallest Jon. I don't want to hear your stubborn bullshit." "I'll come too," Brian said, chin lifted. "I'm your squire. I'm supposed to follow you." One by one, others volunteered, 8 in all. 4 Stark men, 4 Umbers, each of them part of the retinues assigned to keep Jon and Smalljon safe. Kennett and Gannon, the 2 Stark guards Jon had trained himself, were among them. Jon rubbed a hand down his face, torn between gratitude and frustration. They were putting their lives at risk for him, no, for Bran, but he would not refuse them. The bonds of the North ran thicker than blood. "Black Walder," Jon said at last, turning to the Free. "I leave this host in your charge. Sarsfield lies ahead, ready to be taken." Black Walder's grin was all sharp edges. "With pleasure." As Black Walder began shouting orders and getting the army to move, Jon turned to the men who had chosen to follow him on this mad journey south. "Do you even know where we're going?" Smalljon asked, voice gruff. That was the thing, Jon had no idea. Ever since they had started their campaign against the Lannisters, Jon had seen enough maps of the Riverlands that he could get to the border with the Reach without issue, but the vast lands of House Tyrell were ones he did not know. Nor did he know where exactly Bran was being kept. The letter from Renly Baratheon had mentioned Highgarden, but Renly was the Lord of Storm's End. Either would make sense as places to keep his brother, but they were thousands of miles apart. If he guessed wrong, months would be added to their journey. Jon felt his eyes drawn downward. Ghost was gazing at him with a knowing look glinting in his red eyes. Jon might not have any idea where to go, but Ghost seemed to know the way. There were few he would trust with the safety of his brother, and Ghost was one of them. Jon's fingers curled around his reins. "I do," he said. "I know where to go." Chapter 41, Tyrion 6. Tyrion 7. Tyrion Lannister had been working tirelessly in the weeks following the comet's sudden appearance in the sky, a burning red streak that hung ominously above the world for weeks. Common folk were a low-educated and superstitious bunch. Everyone had an opinion as to what the comet would mean, and everyone wanted to share their opinion with others. The city seethed with rumors. Some claimed the comet signaled the coming of a deadly plague, others the sack of the city by one of the claimant kings that would see 100,000 slaughtered. Superstition bred fear, and fear bred chaos. Small brawls had erupted in the alleys of Flea Bottom. Riots sparked in the outer districts where city guards were few. Tyrion, now hand in all but name, had seen the panic for what it was, an opportunity. If people needed meaning, then he would give it to them. He had penned a carefully worded letter to the High Septon, now tucked comfortably in an ornate desk in the Great September. The letter urged the man to speak and to sanctify the comet as a sign of divine approval for King Joffrey. Within days, the voice of the faith rang out over the cobbled streets of King's Landing, proclaiming that the Red Star was the sword of the gods, marking the righteous path of King Joffrey I, light of the realm, chosen to cast down the false kings who threatened the realm's peace. The man was eager to curry favor with the Iron Throne. It worked better than Tyrion had hoped. The panic abated over the following days. The faithful, always eager to be told what to think, began praying to the Seven for Joffrey's victories. The September held extra masses. Even the Gold Cloaks reported fewer disturbances in the city. Still, not everyone was convinced. Varys, ever the spider with his webs, relayed that some in the taverns and brothels still murmured that the comet did not herald victory, but war. A long, bloody war such as Westeros had not seen since dragons danced in the sky. Tyrion feared they might be right. He had spent hours poring over maps in the Tower of the Hand, studying every known movement of every army from the Reach to the Riverlands. The military situation was grim. His father, Lord Tywine, was outnumbered, if not outright outmatched, by the combined might of the North and the Riverlands. Only their disunity, the physical distance between the larger host near Daeari and the smaller force holding Riverrun, spared Tywine from encirclement. But even that luck would not last. Eventually, the young wolf would reunite his banners and bring his wrath to bear against Harrenhal. That was the consensus of the Raven scrolls and reports, which indicated forces were already converging there. And yet the direwolf of House Stark remained unseen. No sightings. No confirmed locations. They had no reports from the Golden Tooth of northern forces and nothing from the few forces they still had in the Riverlands. Either the boy was content to sit at Riverrun or his movements were being masked somehow. Then there were the Baratheon brothers. Word from the south spoke of looming conflict near Storm's End. Stannis had laid siege to his ancestral seat, and Renly, surrounded by his Tyrell allies, marched to lift it. Given the delays in news from the Stormlands, Tyrion suspected that by now, the two forces had already clashed. Perhaps one brother lay dead. Perhaps both. Perhaps an army tens of thousands strong marched on King's Landing at that very moment. Whatever had happened, word had yet to reach the capital. Other regions remained ominously quiet. Dawn did not stir. The Vale of Arryn had not raised its banners. The Ironborn still sulked behind their sea walls. None had declared for the pretender kings, but neither had they rushed to answer Joffrey's call. The Iron Throne, Tyrion realized, had fewer friends than it liked to believe. Unless his father moved from his garrison, which would leave them open to the Starks, the defense of King's Landing fell squarely on Tyrion's shoulders. He had done what he could. Several hundred new men had been conscripted into the Gold Cloaks, and he was hoping for at least 1,000 more. Some were hedge knights who could swing a sword and carried themselves like soldiers. Those men were made sergeants. Others were little more than beggars who had traded their rags for boiled leather and a promise of daily bread. The street of steel rang with hammer and anvil, echoing with the creation of helms and swords, axes and spears. Tyrion had put half the city's smiths to work producing weapons and armor, the other half on a different project. Sir Jacelyn Bywater assured Tyrion that he would turn the beggars into something that resembled a fighting force, and from the few glimpses he caught of them in the yard, Tyrion believed him. He rather liked the one-handed knight and hoped that Robb Stark did not attack King's Landing. He'd hate to have to kill Sir Jacelyn to make sure the man's loyalty to Ned Stark did not have him betraying them for the direwolf. The remaining Crownland houses loyal to the Iron Throne had sent half of their musters to help reinforce the city, a combined total of just over 3,500 fighting men, as Tyrion had requested. Enough to bolster the city's defenses, but not enough to house within the walls. Most were camped to the north of the city, forming a makeshift host along the King's Road. Between them and the expanding gold cloaks, Tyrion hoped to scrape together nearly 8,000 men. Not enough to win a war, but perhaps enough to survive a siege. He had taken no chances with the defenses. New scorpions were being constructed and placed along the castle walls. The Iron Gate, the River Gate, the King's Gate, and the Lion Gate were all reinforced. He spent hours walking the battlements with Sir Aris Oakurt, debating which direction the enemy might come from. Stannis, with his fleet, would likely try a landing on the northern shores of the Blackwater Rush, where the main bridge from the Stormlands also crossed, which meant attacking the River Gate and the King's Gate. But with the ships, they could not rule out Stannis' troops landing north of the city, by the Iron Gate. Renly, by contrast, would march from both the Stormlands and the Reach, which meant not only the River Gate and King's Gate, but also the Lion Gate as well. And then there was his secret weapon. The wildfire, long stored in vaults beneath the Red Keep, had been uncovered and disposed of. Yet Tyrion, intrigued by the substance's volatile promise, had consulted with the Alchemist's Guild. The pyromancers were eager, perhaps too eager, to unleash their green fire upon the enemy. Now they worked day and night, brewing more of the stuff at Tyrion's request. Meanwhile, a massive iron chain was being forged in sections, linked together in secret. Tyrion was tight-lipped even with Cersei about its purpose. He would explain when the time was right. In the midst of preparations, Sir Aris had finally come forward with his long-awaited recommendation for the final vacancy on the Kingsguard. He proposed Sir Balon Swan, the younger son of Lord Gillian Swan of Stony Helm. Balon was young but talented, excellent with lance and morningstar, and by all accounts, deadly accurate with a bow. Tyrion had misgivings. The Swans were Stormlanders. Their loyalty, at best, was split. In talking with their Master of Whispers, Varys assured him that Lord Gillian was conveniently ill and not raising banners for either Renly or Stannis. Yet his heir, Sir Donal Swan, was marching as part of Renly's forces. It was a delicate balancing act, and Tyrion had no way of knowing which way Sir Balon might lean if blood were to be spilled between his king and his kin. He had spoken to the man. Sir Balon seemed the image of chivalry, courteous, composed, modest. But Tyrion had learned long ago that appearances meant nothing at court. He would have to trust Sir Aris' judgment. After months of searching, no better candidates had presented themselves. He briefly considered requesting a Westerlands knight from his father's forces. Men like Sir Lyle Strongbore Crickehall or perhaps his cousin Sir Davin Lannister. Both were formidable in a fight, and dumb enough not to scheme, but perhaps a little too dumb for the White Cloak. Others, like Sir Adam Marbrand, were far more suitable, but too valuable to their houses. No lord would part with an heir, not even for a White Cloak and a place at court. The hardest part of all, of course, would be convincing Joffrey. Honor and chivalry were not words that appealed to his nephew. If Tyrion's observations of Joffrey growing up were correct, then Joffrey would be more interested in the type of Kingsguard that the Mad King had, ones who were skilled, yes, but also those who would keep their silence while the king burned people alive and raped his queen. Tyrion learned from one of the servants that King Joffrey was in the Godswood. He was undoubtedly indulging in his newest pastime, hunting defenseless creatures with a crossbow. It had started with birds, fat pigeons, crows, and the occasional raven, but now stray cats, squirrels, and once even a half-starved dog had been found skewered on bolts, their corpses left throughout the Red Keep where they fell. The entrance to the Godswood was manned by Sir Philip Foot of the Kingsguard and, in Tyrion's estimation, its weakest link. The man stood straight and proud in his white cloak. He did not doubt the man's loyalty, to Cersei first and the king second, but he did doubt the man's skill. If you were going to have someone to guard the king, you should at least want one who would put up a fight. If nothing else, they'd at a minimum slow down any would-be assassins. Bronn could likely kill him with one hand, and if Tyrion was being honest, he was not entirely sure which one he'd bet on if Bronn were blindfolded. A quick glance at his sellsword companion confirmed the thought. Bronn looked bored, his fingers twitching lazily near the hilt of his blade as if itching for a reason to draw. He approached the knight. "Is my nephew within the Godswood?" he asked. "His grace is inside," Sir Philip confirmed stiffly. "But if you wish to speak with him, your companion must remain here." Bronn opened his mouth, to say something snarky no doubt, but Tyrion cut him off with a raised hand. Of course. Bronn, please wait out here. Bronn gave a short nod, but his eyes gleamed with mischief. And try not to kill Sir Philip, Tyrion added with a crooked smile. He's only doing his duty. Sir Philip flushed a dull red, lips thinning in offense, while Bronn's mouth curled into a slow, dangerous grin. The night shifted uncomfortably under Bronn's gaze as Tyrion passed through the stone archway and into the Godswood. It was almost like stepping into another world, cool shadows beneath the tall, whispering trees, and the scent of damp earth. Birds chirped nervously overhead, those that had not yet learned to avoid Joffrey's presence. It did not take long to find the king. Joffrey stood in a clearing, near the old oak that doubled as the heart tree, his golden hair catching the light. Beside him loomed Sandor Clegane, massive in white plate. His hand rested idly on the pommel of his sword, eyes tracking Tyrion's approach. A sparrow chirped once from a branch. A twang followed. The bird disappeared in a puff of feather, skewed body flying deeper into the Godswood. Joffrey grinned. He was nearing 15 now, tall for his age and filled out with the awkward muscle of adolescence. A faint shadow of a mustache stained his upper lip and, like all boys his age, he wore it like a badge of honor. Imp Sandor greeted in his gravelly voice, eyes unmoving. Joffrey turned, his expression immediately soured, his lips curling in disgust that so closely mirrored Cersei's that it was uncanny. Tyrion had grown used to it. In fact, he preferred it. When Joffrey looked at him with contempt, it meant he had not yet found a new way to amuse himself at Tyrion's expense. Tyrion bowed with mock flourish. Your Grace. What is it, uncle? Joffrey asked, annoyed. Can't you see I'm practicing? And doing so admirably, Tyrion said dryly. But I bring good news. Sir Aris has settled upon the 7th member of your Kingsguard. Sir Balon Swan. A knight of notable skill. Joffrey tilted his head. Swan. Where's his house? The Stormlands, Tyrion replied, bracing for the reaction. But worry not. House Swan has not joined either of your uncles. Lord Gillian claims illness and has remained neutral. He conveniently left out that the Swan heir fought for Renly. I don't want some traitorous knight from the Stormlands, Joffrey snarled. He began cranking his crossbow back again, the click of the mechanism harsh in the quiet glade. It is the land of your father, Tyrion reminded him calmly. He eyed the crossbow warily. Joffrey hadn't killed a man yet, not directly, but Tyrion had no illusions about the boy's capacity for cruelty. And he had no desire to become the first. The hound tilted his head and sniffed at the air, a frown on his face. His meaty hand gripped at the hilt of his sword, pulling it slightly from his sheath. Your Grace, an effeminate voice called. They turned to see the Master of Whisperers gliding toward them, hands tucked neatly within his flowing sleeves. As always, he smelled of roses, citrus, and something faintly powdery. His presence clashed with the raw, earthen scent of the Godswood. Varys bowed deeply. I bring word from the Westerlands, Your Grace. Joffrey froze mid-motion, the crank of his crossbow unfinished. More news. Out with it, Spider. Grave news, I'm afraid, Varys said solemnly. A raven from your cousin, Sir Davon Lannister. Robb Stark has massacred the host gathered at Oxcross. Thousands are dead, thousands more captured. Amongst them are Sir Stafford Lannister, Sir Lymond Vicary, Lord Roland Crickehall, Lord Antario Just, and Martin Lannister. Tyrion felt his breath catch. He had been left wondering where the Stark boy was, and it seemed the young wolf had slipped into the Westerlands unnoticed. We had no word from the Golden Tooth, Tyrion whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. No ravens. No scouts. Nothing. Tyrion stood frozen, his mind spinning. How had Robb Stark left Riverrun and crossed into the Westerlands without a whisper? No birds from the Golden Tooth. No horns from the Hill Watch. Not even a whisper. The boy had moved an army of thousands like they were nothing more than a shadow. He felt a cold knot twist in his gut. Sir Stafford had been mustering new levies to help relieve the pressure on their forces in Harrenhal. They were raw recruits, barely trained and led by second-tier lords still polishing their swords, but in a few months they would have been a respectable fighting force, meant to aid his father in the war. They hadn't been meant to fight yet, and now they'd been slaughtered. Joffrey, for a moment, said nothing. His face twisted with confusion, the gears behind his eyes grinding slowly. The crossbow sagged in his grip. Then came the rage. "No," Joffrey spat, lips curling like a dog's. "No, you're lying." "I'm afraid it's true," Your Grace, Varys said gently, his voice soft. "How dare he? I'll have his head. I'll have his direwolf stuffed and mounted in the throne room." Joffrey lifted the crossbow, and for a frightening minute Tyrion thought he was about to be skewered by his nephew's building rage. Instead the bolt slammed into the trunk of the oak tree, burying several inches into the bark. Joffrey tossed the crossbow, his face flushed red with his anger, his breathing heavy. With his hands curled tightly into fists, he stormed from the Godswood. Clegane gave them both a look before he followed after his king. Tyrion gave Varys a grim look. "Do we think the Golden Tooth has fallen?" Without any word. Varys shook his head. "Though I guess we should not rule anything out when it comes to Robb Stark." Tyrion walked to the Tower of the Hand, having left the burden of telling Cersei the grim news of Oxcross to Varys. Let the spider dance around her fury for once. Tyrion had enough battles to fight. Being the Hand of the King was a near-constant struggle, least of which was navigating around Joffrey's cruelty and Cersei's stupidity. And yet, despite the impossible odds stacked against him, he thought he was managing well enough. It wasn't just the threat of siege or starvation he contended with, it was the constant, grinding weight of governance. Beyond the urgent defences being thrown up along the walls of King's Landing, Tyrion labored to finish the work started by Lord Eddard Stark. He had no love for the man, but even he had to admit Stark had seen the rot beneath the gilded surface and tried to mend it. Part of that duty meant overseeing the slow, painful reconstruction of the city's shattered quarters. While the scars of the wildfire explosion had been relatively cleared, there were still open plots of land and half-built structures that required attention in the former areas of Rhaenys Hill and Flea Bottom. Tyrion pressed masons and carpenters into service, wrangling coin and materials to build shops and homes for the city's poor. Then there was the Crown's debt, which was a never-ending problem. When it looked like Lord Stark might be making some headway on it, wildfire tore through the city and tens of thousands of gold needed to be spent to rebuild. Paying the debt off seemed a fool's hope now. He had little choice but to focus instead on securing the coin needed to fund the city's defenses. To that end, he had leaned heavily on taxes. Ned Stark's modest levy on alcohol remained in place, but Tyrion had sharpened the blade further by raising the tax on silk within the Crown lands. The poor had already been bled near dry, there was nothing left to squeeze from them. So instead, he turned his eye to the wealthy merchants, the preening lords, and the pampered septars. They could afford to pay a little more for their luxuries while the city readied itself for war. Eventually, once the rebel lords bent the knee or were broken entirely, the silk tax would expand across the realm. Tyrion doubted it would make him any more beloved, but he no longer cared for love. A living hand could accomplish more than a popular one. What he needed now was not another council meeting, nor another anxious session with his captains over what the loss at Oxcross could mean for them. No, what he needed was a flagon of wine, a soft bed, and Shay's arms around him. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow he would summon Sir Aris Oakurt and Sir Jacelyn Bywater to discuss Oxcross. But not tonight. Even the cleverest dwarf in the Seven Kingdoms could only bear so much weight before his legs gave out. With direwolves prancing through the corners of his mind, Tyrion's gaze settled on the stout, unassuming door that led to the storage room. Supposedly, it held all the effects of the Stark household that had been cleared from the Tower of the Hand, at least what was not pilfered away by opportunistic servants. Tyrion found himself recalling the book Ned Stark had so unsubtly urged him to find and read. What was it again? Some dull tome written by a long-dead Grand Maester. He tapped his fingers against his thigh, trying to summon the name. Grand Maester Mross. No, that didn't sound right. Grand Maester Munkun. No, that wasn't right either. It started with an M, he was sure of it. Mulling it over, Tyrion veered from the stairs and made his way to the door. Thinking of borrowing some of the old hand's clothes. Bronn called after him, a wicked grin playing across his lips. Might need to get them tailored first. Tyrion sighed and rolled his eyes, sarcasm dripping from his lips. Your wit continues to impress me, Bronn. Truly, a marvel for the ages. I am looking for a book, written by a Grand Maester whose name I can't quite recall. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. A musty, stale scent met him instantly. It had been several months since the items had been unceremoniously dumped in this room and forgotten about. Inside, chaos reigned. Chests were crammed against the walls, battered tables leaned drunkenly atop one another, and dusty furnishings from the Stark household had been tossed about without a care. There was no order, items belonging to kitchen servants had been tossed on top of items belonging to Lord Stark. He stepped inside carefully, brushing dust from a toppled chair with a flick of his sleeve. Bronn lingered in the doorway, looking thoroughly unimpressed. Tyrion squinted at a small table buried under a mound of discarded cloth and scrolls. His stubby fingers rifled through the mess until they closed around a thick, leather-bound volume, its cover cracked and stained with age. The lineages and histories of the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms, with descriptions of many high lords and noble ladies and their children by Grand Maester Mallion. Mallion. That was it. Tyrion found a relatively clean bench, plopped himself down, and cracked open the book. The pages were heavy and yellowed with time, the ink still dark and sharp. It listed genealogy, physical descriptions, and marriages of all of the great houses in alphabetical order, every high noble family from Illyrian to Euronwood. He did not have time to skim idly through the pages. He had wars and taxes to think about, not dusty bloodlines. Stark had told him that the pages of the Baratheons were quite the interesting read. Those were the pages he sought out, flipping through until he found what he needed. House Baratheon of Storm's End, descended from Ois Baratheon, bastard brother of Aegon the Conqueror. Traits common among Baratheon lineage: black hair, blue eyes, strong build. Tyrion's eyes narrowed. He thumbed through more entries, noting again and again, black of hair, blue of eyes. Generation after generation, even those who married Targaryens all had children with black hair and blue eyes. Robert Baratheon had been no different. Thick black hair, even thicker body, blue eyes like a summer sky. Same with his brothers, though Stannis Herline had been in retreat the last time he had seen the man. Tyrion frowned, thinking of Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. Golden-haired, all three. And green-eyed too. Every inch a Lannister. He doubled back through the pages, noting that all of the children born of a Baratheon and a Lannister had black hair and blue eyes. If Baratheon blood bred true, if generation after generation bore the unmistakable hallmarks of black hair and blue eyes, how had Robert Baratheon's own children all been born golden-haired and green-eyed? He sat very still for a long moment, the creak of the tower around him loud in the silence. He remembered the letter from Stannis when he claimed himself king. He named the boy who sits the throne Joffrey Waters, a pretender born not of King Robert but of the Queen and her brother, the Kingslayer. He remembered the lack of shock from Cersei, Baelish, and Varys at that news. He had thought maybe there had been some truth to what Stannis wrote, but had pushed the thoughts to the back of his mind. Stannis could make the claim all he wanted, but there was no proof. How had King Robert's children been born without black hair and blue eyes of House Baratheon? They hadn't been. They weren't his children at all. Cersei. Jaime. Tyrion closed the book slowly, his mind racing, a sour taste rising at the back of his throat. No wonder Stark had refused to pledge his loyalty to Joffrey. The man knew that Joffrey was not his best friend's son, and his honor would not let him make a pledge he did not intend to keep. Oh Cersei, you fool! You vain, idiotic, thrice-damned fool! No matter what happened, the North would never cease its rebellion. Honorable Ned Stark would never swear fealty to Joffrey, and keeping him captive, or killing him, would see the North continue the fight. I need wine, he murmured. Going keep doing some light reading? Bronn asked, bored from his spot in the doorway. No, I need to get drunk. Chapter 42, Sansa 4 and Cersei 2. Sansa 4. As they approached Winterfell in the early hours, the sun barely peeking above the eastern horizon, Sansa did not need Jory or any of the other guards to point out something was off. She could tell that herself. There were more men than normal atop the walls, almost double what it usually was. And the heavy doors of the gate were closed. Not just closed, but the portcullis had been lowered as well. The gates were always left open during the day so the servants could come and go to Wintertown as needed. The bells tolling in the night had not been in celebration of a new start, as she had hoped, but for something far worse as Jory had speculated. "Halt and state your business," a sharp, harsh voice shouted from the battlements above the gates. Men with crossbows leaned over the gaps in the wall, aiming at them. Since when did the Stark Guard have crossbows? Before Jory or any of the others could respond, Lady raised her snout to the wind and let loose a long, piercing howl. The sound was answered seconds later by two more howls from within the walls, Nymeria and Shaggydoug. "It's the Lady Sansa," another voice shouted. "Open the gates." The portcullis crept upwards with the clanking of metal, and as it was raised the doors were pulled open with the groan of wood and iron. The inside of the courtyard was as full as she remembered it being, but there was not a servant in sight. Instead it was packed with Stark guards in their gleaming armor, each of them rushing this way and that. One of the guards, who was wearing the same wolf's head brooch Jory wore that signified him as the captain of the guard, approached them. He pulled off his helmet and Sansa could see it was Hal, who offered no smile at the sight of them. He offered Sansa a brief glance before making for Jory. Sansa stepped between them before he could speak. She lifted her chin, drawing herself to her full height. She was almost 15 years old, a woman flowered. She would not be ignored or treated as some simpering child. "We heard the bells tolling in the night, Hal," she said, voice firm. "Tell me what happened." Hal halted in his stride and met her gaze with reluctant eyes. He hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal, then sighed. "There was an attack in the night, my lady. Men armed with daggers came for your family." A hand flew to Sansa's mouth as a gasp escaped her lips. She barely heard the exclamations of alarm from the guards and companions behind her. The stress caused Lady Winifred to go into labor, and she gave birth to a baby boy just before dawn. Both mother and babe are well and safe, and your siblings were not harmed. Relief surged through her, but it was crushed a heartbeat later. However, Hal continued, "Lady Catelyn was stabbed with, what Maester Luwin suspects is, a poisoned blade. He is with her, doing what he can." Jory cursed something so foul Sansa could hear Jane's small gasp of surprise from somewhere behind them. "How did they get in?" Jory demanded. Hal shook his head, face flushed with shame. As captain of the guard, this attack reflected on him more than anyone else. None of those on shift saw anything, or so they claim. We can only assume they snuck in behind some servants before the gates were closed for the evening. 5 were killed in the attempts, and we used the direwolves to discover a 6th who was hiding in a cellar. Well, I assume he was one of them as he had on the same leathers. The direwolves did not leave much left of the man for us to question. Jory grimaced but nodded his head. Hal gestured to the rest of the courtyard, where guards still rushed about. "The keep has remained shut and I am having the men double-check every corner from top to bottom again, without the direwolves." "I can help with," Lady Harwin said, stepping forward, jaw clenched. "She's more behaved than the other two and will listen to me. Mostly." Sansa no longer heard them. If there was anyone else untrustworthy within the keep, Shaggydoug and Nymeria would have discovered them by now, she was sure of that. Instead she was already moving, her feet carrying her swiftly toward the entrance of the Great Keep. Behind her Jane called her name, but she paid her friend no attention. She pulled open the door and there, likely having been told of her arrival, she almost ran into Arya. She had grown since they last saw each other, though still much shorter than Sansa herself. Those grey eyes, which so often glared or rolled with annoyance, were now brimming with tears that mirrored Sansa's own. Arya launched herself forward. Sansa opened her arms and caught her. She squeezed her sister tight, feeling herself embraced in an equally tight grip. Almost as one they broke out into sobs, breathless apologies and relief tumbling out in a tangle of broken sentences and desperate reassurances. The guard who had been trailing Arya shuffled back the way he came to give them space. She didn't know how much time passed before she and Arya released each other. At one point Rickon had joined them, each of the sisters wrapping an arm fiercely around their youngest brother and holding him tight against them. "How is she?" she whispered when their tears had quieted. "Maester Luwin's still with her," Arya answered, sniffling. "He wouldn't let us in." "And Winifred? The baby?" "He's so small," Rickon piped in, his voice hushed. The midwife they brought from Wintertown says they are both doing fine. Do you want to see him? Sansa nodded, brushing her damp cheeks with the back of her hand. She'd give some more time for Maester Lewin to work before she went to see her mother, because when she did go to see her mother she would not be turned away. She would pull an Arya and refuse to take no for an answer. She bent down and scooped Rickon into her arms. He did not squirm or protest as he might have once. Instead, he nestled against her neck and clung to her dress, the fabric clenched tight in his hands. Arya led them to the room Winifred shared with Robb. Sansa suspected that had her brother not marched south with an army, he and Winifred would have moved into one of the larger rooms in the first keep, instead of the room he had grown up in. Outside 2 guards stood, nodding to them as they permitted them entrance into the room. Inside, the room was quiet. Winifred slept soundly beneath a thick quilt, her breathing slow and steady. Beside her sat the midwife, her hair long gone to grey. She nodded at their entrance but returned to her needlework without a word. At the foot of the bed was a wooden cradle that Sansa remembered Rickon sleeping in when he was a baby. It had been a gift from one of the lords, expertly crafted with direwolves carved along the edges. The 3 siblings approached it and peered in at their nephew, who peered back at them. Rickon had been right, he was small but given he was not even a day old that was not surprising. Sansa had been told that a baby's coloring could change within their first year of life but as of that moment her nephew had Winifred's brown hair and Robb's blue eyes. She thought he might have the long face of the Starks as well but it was hard to tell in one so young. Does he have a name? Sansa asked in a whisper. Arya answered with a shrug. Few had been in the room with Winifred during the birth, not with the keep on lockdown and potential assailants roaming the halls. If he had a name, that information has not been shared. They sat admiring their nephew for an indeterminate amount of time. Shortly after their arrival the babe had given a tiny yawn and gone to sleep. They left the room while Winifred still slept, feeling she had more than earned her rest. Sansa sent Rickon to the kitchens to make sure there would be food available for Winifred when she woke up. He nodded eagerly at her request and raced off, wanting to feel useful. A Stark guard hurried after him, his heavy footsteps echoing throughout the corridor. Sansa ascended the familiar stone steps leading to the upper floors of the Great Keep, her footsteps echoing softly in the silent corridor. As she neared the hallway that housed her mother's chambers, she slowed, her eyes catching on the door to her father's solar. How many times had she and Arya tiptoed past it as children, each for entirely different reasons. Sansa reached into the hidden pocket sewn into the folds of the dress given to her by Lord Marndale. Inside, folded to fit into the space, was the letter her father had written to Jon. The letter she had been tasked with making sure her half-brother received. She pulled it out and turned it over in her hands. "What's that?" Arya asked from behind her, having followed after her. "It's a letter," Sansa said quietly. "One father wrote for Jon. I think it's best left in his solar. Somewhere private." Arya stepped closer. "A letter just for Jon? What about the rest of us? Where's my letter? He didn't write any others. Just this one?" Arya's brows drew together in a scowl. "Why would he write to Jon and not anyone else?" Sansa pursed her lips. It was a question she had asked herself multiple times after her escape from King's Landing. Isn't it obvious? Father must have been worried he might not return from King's Landing, so he wrote to tell Jon who his mother is. The words had the effect of a stone dropped in a still pond. Arya's expression shifted. First confusion, then curiosity, and finally an eager look. Before Sansa could move, Arya darted forward, quick as a shadow cat, and snatched the letter from her hands. "Arya!" Sansa cried, grabbing at her sister, but her fingers closed on empty air as Arya danced just out of reach, holding the letter aloft. Arya turned it over in her hands, inspecting the seal. Her brows shot up. "It's still sealed." "Of course it is." Sansa snapped. "It's not mine to open. It's meant for Jon, not me." She had faced the same temptation that Arya faced now, though she had never come this close to breaking the seal. Jon might be a bastard, but he was still her half-brother and she owed him that. Arya's voice dropped to a murmur. "But don't you want to know? Don't you want to know who she was?" Of course I want to know who this unnamed woman is that has haunted Mother all these years, Sansa said, her own voice quieter now. But if Father wanted us to know, he would have told us. He chose to tell Jon. And it's for Jon to tell us when he's ready. Arya looked down at the letter, her lips pressing together. Her thumb hovered near the edge of the seal. One twitch and she could break it open. Just like that. The answers they'd wondered about for years, right there in her hands. Sansa saw it in her eyes, that desire to know the truth. He deserves to be the first to read it, Arya, Sansa added gently, changing her tone. If Jon finds out you opened his letter and read it, if you invaded his personal space and knew who his mother was before him, he'll be beyond hurt. You know this. Arya's teeth caught her lower lip, chewing anxiously. She stared at the letter for another heartbeat, then two. At last, with a huff of frustration and what might have been guilt, she stepped forward and pressed the parchment back into Sansa's waiting hands. I wasn't really going to open it, she muttered, though they both knew she'd come dangerously close. Sansa let out a long, relieved breath. Thank you. Sansa slipped the letter back into the hidden pocket. She'd place it in her father's solar later. They finally approached her mother's door to see a guard standing in front of it. He stiffened at their approach. The guard licked at his lips and cleared his throat. Maester Lewyn said no one is to enter. My father is held hostage in King's Landing. My mother lay within the room behind you after being attacked. My brother wages war in the Riverlands. My good sister is sleeping after waging her own war in the birthing bed. Sansa stepped forward with each statement to emphasize her point. At the moment, I am the Stark in Winterfell, and you would do well to let me and my sister pass. Sansa could hear Arya murmur in amazement, but she did not dare to look at her sister. Instead she kept her gaze on the guard, doing her best to mimic her father's lord face. Yes, my lady. The guard opened the door with a solemn nod and stepped aside, bowing them into the chamber. The heavy scent of blood, herbs, and something akin to rotting fruit assaulted their noses. Sansa had to fight at the bile that rose in her throat. She was fortunate that she did not have a breakfast to throw up. Their mother lay still upon the bed, her skin as pale as a freshly fallen summer snow. Only the shallow rise and fall of her chest gave proof she still lived. The midriff of her dress had been hastily cut away, revealing the angry wound at the center of her abdomen. The gash was raw and swollen, rimmed in a deep, angry red, with festering pus oozing forth. The corrupted flesh seemed to pulse with each laboured breath Catelyn took, and Sansa felt her stomach churn at the sight. Maester Lewyn stood at the bedside, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his brow slick with sweat and concentration. Two handmaids moved at his command, fetching bandages, dabbing the wound with damp cloths, and uncorking small vials from a cluttered side table. The table itself was a chaotic sprawl of glass bottles, copper instruments, and open jars filled with herbs, potions, and salves. Arya, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, slipped her hand into Sansa's. Sansa gave her sister's fingers a gentle but firm squeeze, more to steady herself than Arya. Together they stepped forward. Cersei too. Fools. That was what she found herself surrounded by. A court full of silken fools, and a realm filled with blind, ungrateful traitors. Damn the gods 1,000 times for not letting her be born with a cock between her legs. If she had been born a man, then perhaps her father would finally have a son worthy of his name. Not a twisted little monster with a sharp tongue, nor a golden-haired dolt who could swing a sword but could not think beyond his next sword strike. If she had been born a man, the realm would already be hers. But the gods had denied her that, just as they denied her the respect she was owed. Everything had been going perfectly since Boros Blount, ever the dutiful dullard, had unknowingly brought several jars worth of wildfire onto the Lady Lyanna. Part of the stash hidden beneath the Red Keep, the jars had been taken away under heavy guard, supposedly destroyed or buried far from the capital. But she was the queen and a Lannister of Casterly Rock, and nothing in the Seven Kingdoms was beyond her reach. Not even the Mad King's last legacy. Carefully poured into dark wine bottles, labeled innocently, and loaded onto the ship under her orders, it had waited only for a flame. A single, carefully measured wick, lit by a dockworker whose tongue would never wag again, ensured the explosion would occur far out in the Blackwater Bay, away from shore, but not so far that it was within easy sight of Driftmark. The pyromancer who helped calculate the timing and length of the wick was disposed of with equal precision. Loose ends could not talk if they were dead after all. Robert Baratheon, first of his name, the drunken oaf who had ruined her youth and sullied her bed with wine-soaked breath and grunt-filled rutting, was dead. Not by rebellion, nor by some noble act of fate, but by her hand. The oaf had thought that confining her in the royal chambers, and banishing her loyal men from the Red Keep would leave her weak and vulnerable. If only she could have seen the ship go up in flames, as Robert learned just how powerful she really was. She had rolled her eyes at the small council refusing to accept the ship not making it to Dragonstone, and no sighting of the king, as proof he was dead. They sent ships searching from here to Dragonstone and beyond, but nothing came from the searches. There had been no body or crown. Just a missing ship and whispers on the wind. All the while she sent messages and held secret meetings, readying for what was to come. She had ravens sent to Duskendale and Bronzegate, bringing Tommen and Myrcella back to her side, where they should have been. It was nearly 2 centuries